true scary stories for sleep. Welcome to the Midnight Echoes. Before we dive into tonight's stories, I'd love to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? Drop a comment below. It's always fascinating to see where our viewers are tuning in from. If you enjoy the stories, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get comfortable, unwind, and prepare for tonight's eerie adventures. The town of Black Hollow had always been a quiet, unassuming place, nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I had lived there my whole life, and nothing much ever happened, until the day the darkness came. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, and the shadows seemed to stretch further than they should. At first, people shrugged it off, blaming the strange weather on the changing seasons. But as the darkness grew more oppressive, the town began to change. It wasn't just the length of the nights that was unsettling, it was the quality of the darkness itself. It was thicker, denser, as if the very air had turned to ink. The streetlights barely penetrated it, and the stars seemed to vanish from the sky. People started to avoid going out after sunset, locking their doors and windows as soon as the last rays of daylight faded. And yet, even inside our homes, the darkness found its way in, creeping through the cracks and seeping into our minds. I first noticed it on a cold October night. The sun had set hours earlier, but the darkness outside was impenetrable, like a living thing pressing against the windows. I sat in my living room, the soft glow of the lamp barely illuminating the room, when I heard a noise outside, a soft rhythmic tapping. Someone, or something, was knocking on the window. My heart skipped a beat, and I hesitated for a moment before getting up to check. I pulled back the curtain, but there was nothing there, just the thick, suffocating darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The tapping continued, coming from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch brushing against the window, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The darkness outside felt wrong, malevolent, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Over the next few days, the darkness grew worse. It started to invade our lives in ways that defied explanation. Street lights flickered and died, leaving entire blocks in shadow. People began to complain of strange dreams, nightmares filled with shadowy figures and whispered voices. And then, people started to disappear. It began with a neighbor down the street, an older man who lived alone. He was last seen closing his curtains as the sun set. The next morning, his house was empty. No sign of a struggle, no trace of where he had gone, just an empty house filled with an eerie silence. The disappearances continued, each one more unsettling than the last. Entire families vanished overnight, their homes left undisturbed, as if they had simply stepped out for a moment and never returned. The town grew quieter, the streets emptier, as fear gripped the remaining residents. No one dared to venture out after dark, and even during the day, the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of our vision, always lurking, always waiting. I tried to keep my routine, hoping that normalcy would protect me from whatever was happening, but the darkness had other plans. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard it again, the soft, rhythmic tapping, this time coming from the front door. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, too terrified to move. The tapping continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was a steady, pounding rhythm that echoed through the house. I forced myself to get up, my hands shaking as I made my way to the door. The darkness outside was so thick it seemed to press against the walls, suffocating and oppressive. I peered through the peephole, but there was nothing there, just the endless void of night. Tapping stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. As I turned to go back to bed, I noticed something strange. The darkness inside my house seemed to be moving, shifting in ways that defied logic. It was as if the shadows had taken on a life of their own, creeping along the walls and floor, reaching out with tendrils of inky blackness. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the darkness was relentless, closing in around me, cutting off any escape. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in fear, but eventually the darkness receded, leaving me trembling and drenched in sweat. The house was silent once again, but the memory of that night lingered, haunting me long after the sun had risen. I knew then that the darkness wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was something far more sinister, something that had been unleashed on our town for reasons I couldn't understand. In the days that followed, more people disappeared, and the town grew quieter still. I stopped going outside altogether, too afraid of what might be lurking in the shadows. The darkness continued to grow, consuming everything in its path, until there was nothing left, me and the oppressive weight of night. I don't know how much longer I can hold out, but I fear that it's only a matter of time before the darkness comes for me too. If you ever find yourself in a place where the night feels heavier than it should, where the shadows seem to move on their own and the darkness presses in from all sides, take my advice. Leave while you still can. The darkness is hungry, and once it sets its sights on you, there's no escape. Cabin in the Woods was meant to be an escape, a place where I could unplug, unwind, and forget about the stress of everyday life. Nestled deep in the forest, miles from the nearest town, it was the perfect spot for solitude. The first time I saw it, I was struck by its charm. Rustic, with a weathered exterior and a stone chimney that promised cozy fires on cold nights. But there was something else about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It felt different, like it was holding on to secrets from the past. First night was uneventful, peaceful even. The fire crackled in the hearth and the sound of the wind whispering through the trees lulled me to sleep. But as the night wore on, I was jolted awake by a strange noise. It was faint at first, barely audible over the sound of the wind, but it grew louder, more distinct, a soft rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking on the windows. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding in my chest, straining to listen. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one window to the next. I told myself it was just the wind, maybe a tree branch brushing against the glass. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Tapping was too deliberate, too precise, as if it was following a pattern. I got up and checked the windows, but there was nothing there, just the dark, impenetrable forest beyond. The noise eventually stopped, and I went back to bed, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me. The next day, I tried to brush it off as a figment of my imagination, product of being alone in a strange place. The feeling of unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. As the sun set and the shadows lengthened, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone in the cabin. The air inside felt heavy, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. The fire in the hearth didn't seem as warm, the glow from the flames casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. That night, the noises returned, louder and more insistent than before. It wasn't just the tapping this time. There were whispers too, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. They seemed to come from the walls, floor, the very foundation of the cabin. I tried to block them out, telling myself it was just the old wood settling, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until I could almost make out words. My heart raced as I lay there, listening to the disembodied voices that seemed to surround me. The next morning, I found strange markings on the walls near the windows, scratches that hadn't been there the day before. They were deep, jagged, like claw marks, and they sent a chill down my spine. I couldn't explain how they had gotten there, and the thought of staying another night in the cabin filled me with dread. But I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was just the work of animals, or perhaps the wind. I wasn't ready to leave just yet. I had come here to escape, after all. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin grew even more oppressive. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature dropped sharply, despite the fire roaring in the hearth. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something unseen was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, and the tapping became a steady, relentless rhythm that echoed through the cabin. I tried to ignore it, but the fear was overwhelming. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind that rattled the windows sent my heart racing. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and writhing in the flickering firelight. And then, in the dead of night, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. Panic surged through me as I bolted out of bed, my flashlight flickering in my trembling hand. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and stumbled out of the cabin into the freezing night air. I didn't stop running until I was at my car, the cabin looming behind me like a dark sentinel in the woods. I left that night, not daring to look back. Haunted cabin still stands, its secrets locked within its walls, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to uncover them. I've never spoken of what I saw there, and I've never returned to those woods. The memories of that place still haunt me, the tapping at the windows, the whispers in the walls, and the shadowy figure that watched me in the night. If you ever find yourself in a remote cabin in the woods, take my advice. Listen to your instinct. Some places are meant to be left alone, and the darkness that lingers there doesn't take kindly to intruders. There's something about darkness that always fascinated me, especially when it's the kind that seems to have a life of its own. I've experienced my fair share of eerie nights in the wilderness, but nothing quite like what happened during my trip to the remote village of Raven Hollow. Nestled in a dense forest and isolated from the rest of the world, the village was known for its thick fogs and unusually long nights. Locals claimed that the darkness there was different, more than just the absence of light. I was skeptical, but curious enough to see it for myself. When I arrived, the village seemed normal enough, though there was an unsettling stillness in the air. The streets were empty, and the houses looked old and worn, like they had been standing for centuries. The locals were polite but distant, and there was an unspoken rule that no one ventured outside after sunset. They said the darkness wasn't safe, that strange things happened when the night came. Again, I dismissed it as superstition, until I experienced it firsthand. My first night in Raven Hollow was quiet, too quiet. The kind of silence that presses down on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. The inn where I was staying was small and cozy, but even inside, the darkness seemed to creep in from every corner. As the sun set, the night descended faster than I expected, swallowing the village whole. It wasn't like any darkness I'd ever seen. It felt thick, almost tangible, as if the shadows themselves had substance. I sat by the window, watching as the last slivers of light disappeared, leaving the world outside in complete blackness. The streetlights did little to cut through it, their glow feeble and distant. The only sound was the occasional creak of the old building settling. Beyond that, there was nothing. It was as if the darkness had consumed everything. I tried to sleep. The silence was oppressive, making it impossible to relax. Around midnight, I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking against the window. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping was slow and deliberate, each knock echoing in the stillness. I hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to check. When I pulled back the curtain, there was nothing there, just the inky blackness that seemed to press against the glass, almost alive. The tapping stopped as soon as I looked, leaving me with an uneasy feeling that something was watching me. The next day, I asked the innkeeper about the strange events. She only shook her head and told me to stay inside after dark. The darkness here isn't like anywhere else, she warned. It has a way of getting into your mind, making you see things that aren't there. Or maybe they are. Her words stuck with me as the day wore on, the sun's light gradually fading as night approached once more. That evening, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The air was thick with an eerie tension, and the darkness seemed to creep in earlier, faster, like it couldn't wait to envelop the village again. I decided to stay in my room, hoping to avoid whatever strange phenomena had disturbed me the night before. But as the night deepened, the tapping returned, this time louder and more insistent. It wasn't just at the window now. It was at the door, the walls, all around me. I tried to ignore it, but the sound grew louder, more frantic, until it felt like the darkness itself was trying to break into the room. The shadows on the walls began to move, shifting and twisting in ways that defied explanation. They seemed to reach out towards me, their forms writhing and pulsating as if alive. My heart raced as I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The darkness had surrounded me, trapping me in its suffocating embrace. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, tapping stopped. The shadows receded, melting back into the walls, and the room fell silent once more. But the feeling of being watched lingered. Old, unrelenting presence that refused to leave. I didn't sleep that night, too terrified of what might happen if I closed my eyes. The next morning, I packed my things and left Raven Hollow without looking back. The villagers watched me go, their expressions unreadable, but I knew they understood. They had lived with the darkness for generations, learned to coexist with it. But I couldn't. The memory of that night still haunts me, chilling reminder that some places hold more than just shadows in the night. If you ever find yourself in a place where the darkness seems too thick, too heavy, take my advice. Leave before it's too late. The darkness in Raven Hollow isn't just a lack of light. It's something else entirely. Something that watches, waits, and feeds on fear. The villagers may have learned to live with it, but for outsiders like us, it's a danger we can't afford to ignore. Once you've felt that kind of darkness, it never truly leaves you. It follows, lingering in the corners of your mind, haunting presence that reminds you of what you barely escaped. I've always found solace in the solitude of nature. There's something about being alone in the wilderness, clears the mind and rejuvenates the spirit. But my last solo trip into the mountains of Alaska taught me that solitude can also be terrifying. The plan was simple. Spend a week hiking through some of the most remote terrain, away from all civilization, just me and the wild. I had done it countless times before, but this trip would be different, hauntingly different. First few days were peaceful. The mountains stretched out before me, endless and majestic, and the crisp air filled my lungs with a sense of freedom. I set up camp by a crystal-clear stream, the sound of water rushing over rocks soothing me to sleep each night. There was no sign of anyone else for miles, and that's exactly how I wanted it. But as the days passed, an unsettling feeling began to creep in. It started with small things. A rustling in the bushes that didn't seem to match the wind. A strange stillness that settled over the forest during the day. The usual sounds of wildlife seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence that left me on edge. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. But deep down, I knew something was off. On the fourth night, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my tent. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was circling the camp. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened, frozen in place. The footsteps were too heavy to be an animal, but I was miles away from the nearest person. I reached for my flashlight, but by the time I worked up the courage to unzip the tent and shine it outside, the footsteps had stopped. The forest was still, the silence oppressive. The next morning I found strange tracks around my campsite. They were large, humanoid, but with elongated toes that dug deep into the earth. They didn't match any animal tracks I'd ever seen, and the sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to move camp, hoping that whatever had been watching me would lose interest. But as I packed up my gear, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like unseen eyes were following my every move. That night, the footsteps returned, this time closer and more insistent. They circled my new campsite, coming closer with each pass. I sat in my tent, gripping my knife, my flashlight flickering as I waited for whatever was out there to reveal itself. But it never did. The footsteps eventually faded into the distance, leaving me with only the sound of my ragged breathing and the knowledge that I was not alone. By the sixth day, the sense of dread had become overwhelming. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle in the trees sent my heart racing. I decided to cut the trip short and head back to civilization. But the journey out of the wilderness was fraught with tension. Feeling of being followed never left me, and I could hear faint footsteps behind me, just out of sight, matching my pace as I hurried through the forest. On the last night, as I made camp for what I hoped would be the final time, I heard a low growl in the darkness. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a malice that made my blood run cold. I didn't sleep at all that night, keeping the fire burning bright and my eyes wide open. The growl came and went, echoing through the trees, but whatever was out there never showed itself. It was toying with me, letting me know that it was close, too close. When I finally reached the trailhead the next day, the sense of relief was palpable. I had made it out, but the experience left a mark on me. The wilderness, once my sanctuary, had shown me its darker side. A side where the natural order gives way to something far more sinister. I never saw what followed me on that trip, but the memory of those footsteps in the night still haunts me. If you ever find yourself alone in the wilderness, take my advice. Don't ignore that feeling in the pit of your stomach. Nature is beautiful, but it can also be terrifying, and sometimes the isolation you seek may come with a cost. Listen to the sounds around you, trust your instincts, and if you ever feel like you're being watched, you probably are. I've always had a fascination with forgotten places, those eerie spots on the map that time seems to have left behind. So when I heard about a village in Eastern Europe that had a reputation for disappearing, I couldn't resist the urge to see it for myself. The village was tucked away in a remote part of the Carpathian Mountain, so isolated that even the locals spoke of it in hushed tones. They called it the Vanishing Village, and the stories surrounding it were as chilling as they were mysterious. The journey there was long and treacherous, the narrow mountain roads winding through dense forests that seemed to close in around me. By the time I arrived, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows over the landscape. The village was small, with old stone cottages and cobblestone streets that looked like they hadn't been touched in centuries. But there was something strange about it, an unsettling stillness that hung in the air like a heavy fog. As I walked through the village, I noticed that the buildings were in perfect condition, no signs of decay or neglect. Yet there were no people. The windows were dark, the doors closed, and the streets empty. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. Called out, but my voice echoed off the stone walls, unanswered. The silence was oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to stay the night, hoping that someone would eventually return and explain the strange atmosphere. I found an old inn near the village square. Door unlocked and settled in. The interior was as well preserved as the rest of the village, with old wooden furniture and a large fireplace that looked like it had been recently used. But the eerie silence persisted, and as night fell, the feeling of unease grew stronger. That night, I was jolted awake by the sound of footsteps outside my room. They were slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth in the hallway. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent. I got up and opened the door. The hallway was empty. Just the same dark, silent corridor I had walked down earlier. The next morning, the village was just as empty as before. I explored further, searching for any clues to what had happened. Found nothing. Buildings were all in perfect condition, yet there were no signs of life. No people, no animals, not even birds. The feeling of being watched never left me, and I couldn't shake the sense that the village itself was hiding something that didn't want to be found. As the day wore on, I noticed something even more disturbing. The village seemed to be changing. Streets that I had walked down earlier now led to different places. Buildings seemed to shift positions when I wasn't looking. It was subtle at first. The more I explored, the more disorienting it became. It was as if the village was alive, twisting and warping around me, trying to trap me in its labyrinthine streets. By the time night fell again, I was thoroughly unnerved. I returned to the inn, determined to leave the next morning, but sleep didn't come easily. Footsteps returned, louder and more frantic, and I could hear faint whispers, like voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the air grew thick with an oppressive, suffocating presence. I knew then that I had to leave. Whatever was happening in that village, I didn't want to be a part of it. First light, I packed my things and made my way to the village square. The path I had taken the day before was gone. The streets twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, leading me in circles as the whispers grew louder. Panic set in as I realized I was lost, trapped in a village that didn't want me to leave. The buildings seemed to loom over me, their windows dark and empty, like eyes watching my every move. Just when I thought I would never find my way out, I stumbled upon the road that led out of the village. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back until I was far away. When I finally did, the village had vanished, swallowed by the dense forest as if it had never been there at all. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent, with no sign of the place I had just escaped. I never spoke of what happened in that village, and I've never tried to find it again. The vanishing village remains a mystery, a place that exists only on the edges of reality, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon it. If you ever find yourself deep in the Carpathian Mountains and come across a village that doesn't seem quite right, take my advice, leave immediately. The village may seem inviting, but it holds a dark secret, and once you enter, it may never let you go. There's something about abandoned places that draws me in. The mystery, history, the sense of exploring a world that time has left behind. So when I heard rumors of an old military bunker hidden deep in the woods, I couldn't resist the urge to check it out. The bunker had been forgotten for decades, a relic of the Cold War, and only a few locals even knew it existed. They said it was dangerous, strange things had happened there, but I brushed it off as nothing more than urban legend. The hike to the bunker was long and arduous, the dense forest making it easy to see why the place had been forgotten. By the time I found it, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees. The entrance was almost completely overgrown, the heavy steel door rusted and hanging off its hinges. The air around the bunker was still, and the usual sounds of the forest seemed to fade as I approached, leaving only an eerie silence. I hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The interior was cold and damp, the walls lined with peeling paint and crumbling concrete. Old equipment lay scattered on the floor, rusted metal, broken computers, and torn papers that had long since yellowed with age. The air smelled of mildew and decay, and the sound of my footsteps echoed eerily through the empty corridors. As I explored deeper into the bunker, I began to notice strange things. The walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and equations that made no sense to me. Some of the rooms were filled with old medical equipment, kind you'd expect to find in a hospital, not a military bunker. And then there were the cages, small metal cages that looked like they had been used to hold animals, though the rusted bars and scattered bones suggested otherwise. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Air grew colder, and the silence was broken only by the occasional drip of water from the ceiling. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The bunker felt alive, as if it was watching me, waiting for something. Finally, I came across a large, reinforced door at the end of a long corridor. It was slightly ajar, and a faint, metallic smell wafted out from the darkness beyond. My heart pounded in my chest as I pushed the door open, revealing a room that looked like a laboratory. Old, decayed equipment lay scattered around the room, and in the center stood a large glass chamber, surface cracked and fogged with condensation. Inside the chamber was something, a twisted, grotesque figure that was barely recognizable as human. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. The thing inside the chamber was long dead, its body contorted in unnatural ways, its eyes hollow and lifeless. But what unnerved me the most were the markings on its skin, those same strange symbols that I had seen on the walls, etched into its flesh like a grotesque tattoo. I didn't know what had happened here, but it was clear that whatever experiments had been conducted in this bunker had gone horribly wrong. As I stood there, staring at the chamber, I heard a noise behind me, faint scraping sound like metal dragging across concrete. My heart skipped a beat and I spun around, my flashlight beam darting through the darkness. The corridor behind me was empty, but the noise persisted, growing louder and more deliberate. It was coming from somewhere deeper in the bunker, echoing through the labyrinth of tunnels. I tried to tell myself it was just the building settling, or maybe an animal that had found its way inside. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate, like footsteps. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the urge to see what was causing the noise. With my heart pounding in my chest, I followed the sound, moving cautiously down the corridor. The deeper I went, the more the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, and the metallic smell intensified, filling my nostrils with a sickly, pungent odor. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the flickering of my flashlight only added to the sense of unease. I reached another door at the end of the corridor, this one heavier than the last, with deep scratches gouged into the metal. My hands trembled as I pushed the door open, revealing a room that was even more disturbing than the one before. This room was filled with large metal tables, each one covered in restraints and strange devices that looked like they belonged in a nightmare rather than a laboratory. The walls were lined with more cages, some of them bent and twisted, as if something had tried to force its way out. Bloodstains marred the floor, dark and dried, telling a story of violence and suffering. In the corner of the room, I noticed a pile of old, tattered notebooks, their pages yellowed with age. I picked one up and began to flip through it, faded writing barely legible. The entries described a series of experiments conducted on both animals and humans, aimed at unlocking some kind of hidden potential within the mind. The details were vague, but the more I read, the more horrifying the implications became. Whatever they had been trying to achieve, it had gone horribly wrong. As I stood there, absorbed in the notebook, the scraping sound returned, this time louder and closer. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever had been making the noise was right outside the door. I slowly lowered the notebook and turned toward the entrance, my heart racing as I listened to the sound of something heavy and slow dragging itself across the floor. I backed away from the door, my eyes locked on the darkness beyond. The air grew thick with a sense of dread, and I could feel the presence of something malevolent just beyond the threshold. The scraping stopped suddenly, and for a moment there was only silence, oppressive, suffocating silence. Then I saw it, a shadowy figure, barely visible in the dim light, slowly creeping into the room. It was grotesque, its body twisted and malformed, covered in the same strange symbols that I had seen on the walls and the creature in the chamber. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, empty and lifeless, yet filled with an unmistakable sense of hunger. My breath caught in my throat as it moved closer, dragging itself toward me with unnatural, jerky movements. I stumbled backward, my flashlight flickering wildly as I searched for an escape. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, and I could feel its gaze burning into me, pulling me into its twisted world of pain and madness. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the metallic smell of blood and decay filled the air. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and bolted for the door, creature's growls echoing in my ears as I fled. I didn't look back as I sprinted down the corridor, my footsteps pounding against the cold concrete floor. The bunker seemed to twist and turn around me, the walls closing in, but I didn't stop until I burst through the entrance and into the open air. I didn't stop running until I was far away from the bunker, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to process what I had just experienced. Forest was silent, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind, but the memory of that place lingered, haunting me. I knew I could never go back, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the bunker and whatever horror it contained would remain hidden in the darkness, waiting for the next unsuspecting soul to stumble upon it. If you ever hear rumors of a forgotten bunker deep in the woods, take my advice, don't go looking for it. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and the secrets they hold are better left buried. There's something inherently eerie about driving down a desolate highway in the dead of night. A long, empty stretch of road, a darkness pressing in from all sides. It's enough to make anyone's imagination run wild. I've driven plenty of lonely roads in my time, but none of them compared to the stretch of highway I found myself on that night. Locals called it the haunted highway, and after my experience, I understood why. It was just past midnight, and I was on my way home from a weekend trip. The GPS had taken me on a back route, narrow 2-lane road that cut through miles of dense forest. Trees loomed high on either side, their branches twisting like skeletal fingers reaching out toward the car. The headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled over the road, casting eerie shadows that danced and flickered at the edges of my vision. I was alone. No other cars in sight, no sign of civilization for miles. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the steady thump of the tires on the asphalt. But as the fog grew thicker, the atmosphere shifted. The darkness seemed to deepen, the trees closing in around me, and an unsettling feeling settled over the car, like something was watching me from just beyond the reach of the headlight. It was then that I saw him, a figure standing by the side of the road, barely visible, the fog. He was dressed in dark, tattered clothes, his face obscured by the shadows. His thumb was out, hitchhiking. Something about him made my skin crawl. I slowed down instinctively, but as I got closer, the sense of dread grew stronger. I couldn't see his face. I could feel his eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I passed him by, my heart pounding in my chest. For a moment, I considered stopping to help, but the unease was too strong. I kept driving, the figure disappearing into the fog behind me. But just as I began to relax, I saw him again, standing by the side of the road, in the same tattered clothes, his thumb still outstretched. It was impossible. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. Yet there he was, as if the road had looped back on itself. I drove past him again, a grip tightening on the steering wheel. The air in the car felt thick, suffocating, and the fog seemed to press in from all sides. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me, but the road behind me was empty. The unease turned to fear, and I pressed down on the gas, desperate to put distance between myself and whatever was out there. But no matter how fast I drove, the figure kept appearing. Every few miles, he would be there, standing by the side of the road, his dark silhouette barely visible through the fog. Each time he was closer, presence more menacing. I could feel his eyes on me, cold and relentless, and the sense of dread grew stronger with each passing mile. The road seemed endless, darkness impenetrable, and the figure unrelenting. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. There was no logic to it. It was as if I had been caught in some kind of nightmare, trapped on a road that had no end, with a figure that would never stop following me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog began to lift. The darkness receded, and the road opened up before me. The figure was gone, and the oppressive feeling that had hung over the car faded away. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, my hands shaking as I pulled into a gas station. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled inside, but I didn't care. I was just relieved to be off that highway. I never found out who or what figure on the road was. Some say it's the ghost of a hitchhiker who died on that stretch of highway, forever doomed to wander the road in search of a ride that never comes. Others believe it's something darker, a malevolent spirit that preys on those who travel the road at night. Whatever it was, I knew I never wanted to see it again. Do you ever find yourself driving down a lonely highway in the middle of the night, and you see a figure standing by the side of the road? Take my advice. Don't stop. Some roads are haunted, and the things you see on them might not be what they seem. Keep driving, and don't look back, because whatever is out there might just be waiting for you to slow down. There's something unsettling about ghost towns, those places where life once thrived but now stand eerily silent, abandoned to the elements. I've always been drawn to them, fascinated by the stories they hold, the secrets buried beneath their decaying facade. Though when a group of friends invited me to explore an old ghost town deep in the desert, I couldn't resist. The town had been abandoned for decades, a relic of the gold rush era, and it was said that those who ventured too close to the graveyard often left with more than just memories. The drive out to the ghost town was long and hot, the desert stretching out endlessly in every direction. By the time we arrived, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the crumbling buildings and rusting machinery that dotted the landscape. The town was exactly what I had expected: empty, lifeless, and drenched in history. But there was an eerie stillness to the place, as if the very air was holding its breath. We wandered through the streets, exploring the old saloons, general stores, and abandoned homes. The wind whistled through the broken windows, and the floorboards creaked under our feet as we walked through buildings that hadn't seen life in decades. But it wasn't until we reached the outskirts of town that the atmosphere truly shifted. The graveyard stood on a small hill, overlooking the town like a silent sentinel. The tombstones were old and weathered, their inscriptions barely legible, and the ground was overgrown with weeds and dry brush. As we approached the graveyard, the air grew colder, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the faint scent of decay. There was something about the place that made my skin crawl, a sense of dread that hung heavy in the air. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances. Curiosity got the better of us, and we ventured inside. The graveyard was small, only a few dozen graves, but each one seemed to tell a story. The tombstones were marked with the names of those who had died young, victims of disease, accidents, and violence. It was a reminder of how harsh life had been in this remote corner of the world. We split up, each of us wandering among the tombstones, reading the faded inscriptions. But as I moved deeper into the graveyard, I began to feel a strange presence, an eerie sensation that I was being watched. I glanced around, but there was no one there, just the silent graves and the wind rustling through the weeds. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I noticed the shadows. At first, I thought it was just the setting sun casting strange shapes on the ground. The shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and twisting in unnatural ways. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination. The feeling of being watched grew stronger. The air around me felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the wind began to howl, carrying with it faint whispers that sent chills down my spine. I turned to call out to my friends, the words caught in my throat. There, at the edge of the graveyard, stood a figure, a tall, shadowy silhouette that seemed to blend with the darkness. I blinked, thinking it was just a trick of the light. The figure remained, unmoving and watching. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away, but the figure didn't follow. It just stood there, silent and ominous. My friends must have sensed something too, because they started to gather near the entrance of the graveyard, their faces pale and nervous. No one said a word as we quickly made our way out, the oppressive feeling lifting slightly as we left the graveyard behind. But the unease lingered, and none of us could shake the feeling that we had been followed. As we drove away from the ghost town, the sky darkened, and the desert seemed to close in around us. The silence in the car was heavy, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional nervous laugh. We tried to brush it off, convincing ourselves that it was just the eerie atmosphere of the place playing tricks on us. But deep down, we all knew that something had been there, something that didn't want us to leave. Later that night, as we set up camp miles away from the ghost town, the strange feeling returned. The air grew cold, and the wind picked up, rustling the canvas of our tents. And then, in the distance, I heard it. Faint whisper, carried on the breeze. It was the same voice I had heard in the graveyard, a voice that didn't belong in this world. My friends heard it too, and we huddled together, trying to convince ourselves it was just the wind. But the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent, until they were all around us. Shadows danced at the edge of the firelight, and the desert night seemed to close in, pressing down on us with a weight that made it hard to breathe. We didn't sleep that night, too afraid of what might happen if we closed our eyes. By morning, the whispers had faded, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The ghost town graveyard is a place where the past refuses to rest, where the spirits of the dead linger, trapped between worlds. If you ever find yourself wandering through a forgotten place like that, take my advice. Don't linger too long. The dead may be quiet, but they are never truly gone. And sometimes they don't appreciate being disturbed. I've always been intrigued by stories of places that exist on the edge of reality. Towns that appear and disappear. Villages that seem to slip in and out of time. So when I heard about a disappearing village in Eastern Europe, I knew I had to see it for myself. The village, hidden deep in the Carpathian Mountains, was said to vanish without a trace, only to reappear days or even weeks later. The locals avoided the place, claiming it was cursed. That only fueled my curiosity. The journey to the village was difficult. The narrow mountain roads winding through dense forests that seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I arrived, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the rugged landscape. The village itself was small, just a handful of old stone cottages clustered around a central square. It looked like something out of a fairy tale, untouched by time, yet there was an unsettling stillness in the air. As I walked through the village, I noticed that everything seemed perfectly preserved. The houses were in pristine condition, with no signs of decay or neglect. Yet there were no people, no signs of life at all. The windows were dark, the doors closed, and the streets empty. It was as if the villagers had simply vanished, leaving everything behind. I called out, but my voice echoed off the stone walls, unanswered. The longer I stayed, the more unnerved I became. The village felt wrong, like it wasn't supposed to be there. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow slipping between the buildings, a figure disappearing around a corner. But whenever I looked, there was nothing there. I decided to spend the night in the village, hoping that someone would eventually return. I found an old inn near the square, its door unlocked, and settled in. The interior was as well preserved as the rest of the village, with old wooden furniture and a large stone fireplace that looked like it had been used recently. But the eerie silence persisted, and as night fell, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. Around midnight, I was awakened by a strange noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking on the window. My heart pounded in my chest as I lay there, listening. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, moving from one window to the next. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too precise. I got up and checked the windows, but there was nothing there, just the dark, impenetrable night outside. The next morning, the village was just as empty as before. Something had changed. The streets no longer seemed to lead where they should, and the buildings appeared to have shifted positions overnight. It was subtle at first, but the more I explored, the more disorienting it became. It was as if the village was alive, twisting and warping around me, trying to trap me within its labyrinthine streets. As the day wore on, the sense of dread grew stronger. The air was thick and heavy, and the shadows seemed to cling to the edges of my vision, always just out of reach. I decided to leave. Finding my way out proved more difficult than I expected. The roads twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, leading me in circles as the sun began to set. The village seemed to close in around me, its buildings looming over me like silent sentinels. Just when I thought I would never find my way out, I stumbled upon the road that led back into the mountain. I didn't hesitate. I ran as fast as I could, not daring to look back until I was far away. When I finally did, the village had vanished, swallowed by the dense forest as if it had never been there at all. The road stretched out before me, empty and silent, with no sign of the place I had just escaped. I never spoke of what happened in that village, and I've never tried to find it again. The disappearing village remains a mystery, a place that exists only on the edges of reality, waiting for the next traveler to stumble upon it. If you ever find yourself deep in the Carpathian Mountains and come across a village that doesn't seem quite right, take my advice. Leave immediately. The village may seem inviting, but it holds a dark secret, and once you enter, it may never let you go. I've always been drawn to the sea, especially the remote and desolate places where the land meets the ocean. There's something hauntingly beautiful about the isolation, endless expanse of water stretching out to the horizon. So when I heard about an abandoned lighthouse on a small, forgotten island, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The lighthouse had been out of service for decades, left to decay as the sea slowly reclaimed the land around it. The journey to the island was rough. The sea was choppy, and the thick fog that rolled in only added to the eerie atmosphere. By the time I reached the island, the lighthouse loomed out of the mist like a ghostly sentinel. Its once white walls were streaked with grime, and the windows were broken, giving it a hollow, vacant look. The island itself was barren, just jagged rocks and a few scraggly trees, the lighthouse standing at the highest point, watching over the desolate landscape. As I made my way up the rocky path to the lighthouse, the air grew colder, and the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks below seemed to fade, replaced by an eerie silence. The door to the lighthouse creaked open with a groan, and I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The interior was in disrepair, broken furniture, scattered debris, and the walls covered in strange, faded symbols that I couldn't decipher. I climbed the winding staircase, the metal steps groaning under my weight. The higher I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of the past, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached the top, my heart was pounding, and I had to catch my breath before stepping out onto the narrow platform that encircled the beacon. The view from the top of the lighthouse was breathtaking, an endless expanse of ocean on one side and the desolate island on the other. But as I stood there, taking it all in, I noticed something strange. The fog that had been swirling around the island seemed to grow thicker, more solid, as if it was alive. It wrapped around the lighthouse, blocking out the sun and plunging the world into a dim, gray twilight. I turned to go back inside, but that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the fog, just beyond the edge of the platform. It was barely visible, a dark silhouette against the swirling mist, but I could feel its presence, cold, menacing, and unrelenting. My breath caught in my throat, and I backed away, my heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching me with eyes I couldn't see but could feel burning into my soul. I hurried back down the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty lighthouse. The air inside felt even colder than before, and the strange symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lighthouse was alive, that it had been waiting for someone to come back and awaken whatever had been trapped within its walls. As I reached the bottom, I heard a noise, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like something was knocking on the windows. The sound echoed through the empty space, growing louder and more insistent. My flashlight flickered, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. Panic set in as I realized that whatever was out there wasn't going to let me leave. I rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. Felt as if something was holding it shut, trapping me inside. The tapping grew louder, more frantic, and the air grew thick with the smell of salt and decay. I could feel the presence of the figure outside, pressing against the walls, trying to force its way in. My heart raced as I struggled with the door, finally managing to pry it open just enough to squeeze through. I stumbled out into the fog, cold air hitting me like a wave. The figure was gone, but the sense of dread lingered, clinging to me like a second skin. I didn't stop running until I reached the boat, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the engine. As I sped away from the island, the lighthouse faded into the distance, swallowed by the fog, but the memory of that place has never left me. The abandoned lighthouse still stands, its beacon dark, its halls empty, but those who know the stories stay far away. The haunting presence that lingers there is a reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. If you ever find yourself near an old, forgotten lighthouse, take my advice. Don't go inside. The sea may have forgotten it. The darkness that dwells within never will. Working the night shift at an old factory might sound dull, but for me, it was a chance to escape the monotony of daily life. Factory had been around for decades, and its age showed in the creaking floors, peeling paint, and dim lighting. My job as a security guard was straightforward: monitor the security cameras and make sure no one trespassed. But on this particular night, things started to feel off. The air was thick with a chilling sense of unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with the noises. Faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the security monitors. I told myself it was just the building settling, but the sounds grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps echoed through the empty halls. When I checked the cameras, there was no one there. The shadows on the screens seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting in ways that made no sense. My heart pounded in my chest, and I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. As the night wore on, the eerie atmosphere intensified. I began to see things. Shadowy figures flickering across the monitors, disappearing as soon as I tried to focus on them. At first, I thought it was just a glitch, but the figures grew more defined, more real. They moved through the factory with purpose, as if they were searching for something. The unsettling feeling in my gut told me that whatever they were looking for wasn't good. I decided to do a patrol of the factory, hoping that walking through the halls would calm my nerves. But as I made my way through the dimly lit corridors, the strange noises followed me. Footsteps were louder now, echoing off the concrete walls, and I could hear whispers, faint and indistinct, like voices carried on the wind. The factory, which had always felt empty and lifeless, now seemed alive with something malevolent. When I returned to the security office, I saw it, figure standing in the shadows, just out of reach of the camera's light. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it move, slow and deliberate, its form barely visible but unmistakably human. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back into the factory, determined to find out what was going on. But the moment I stepped into the hall, the temperature dropped, and the air grew thick with a suffocating presence. The figure appeared again, this time closer, its outline barely distinguishable from the darkness that surrounded it. I called out, but there was no response, just the sound of my own voice echoing through the empty halls. The figure moved toward me, steps slow and deliberate, and I could feel the air grow colder with each passing second. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, frozen in place by a fear that gripped me from the inside out. Finally, I managed to force myself to turn and run, my footsteps pounding against the concrete floor as I fled back to the security office. I slammed the door shut behind me, my heart racing as I tried to catch my breath. But the figure didn't stop, followed, its footsteps growing louder, more insistent, until they were right outside the door. The whispers grew louder too, filling the room with a haunting chorus of voices that made my skin crawl. I knew I couldn't stay in the factory any longer. Whatever was stalking me wasn't going to stop until it had me. I grabbed my things and bolted for the exit, not daring to look back. As I ran through the darkened halls, I could feel the figure closing in, its presence pressing against my back like a chilling wind. The whispers were all around me now, drowning out everything else, and I could feel the darkness closing in from all sides. When I finally burst through the doors and into the night air, the oppressive feeling lifted, and the whispers stopped. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I sped away from the factory, I could still feel the cold presence lingering, like a shadow that refused to let go. I never returned to that job, and I've never spoken of what happened that night, but the memory of those shadowy figures and the haunting whispers still follows me, a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk in the dark. If you ever find yourself working the night shift in an old, abandoned place, take my advice. Trust your instincts. The darkness can hide many things, and some of them are far more dangerous than you can imagine. The factory may be empty, but that doesn't mean you're alone. There's something about carnivals that always fascinated me. The bright lights, the laughter, the thrill of the rides. But when a mysterious carnival appeared overnight on the outskirts of town, I felt a chill instead of excitement. My friends and I decided to check it out. curious about the strange atmosphere that seemed to surround it. The entrance was grand, colorful banners and flashing lights. There was something off, an eerie feeling that lingered in the air, as if the carnival was hiding something sinister beneath its cheerful facade. As soon as we stepped inside, unease grew stronger. The rides were old and creaky, their paint peeling and rusting, and the carnival workers looked different. They wore costumes that were just a bit too elaborate, with masks that covered their faces completely, hiding any trace of emotion. The way they moved, the way they stared, it was unsettling. My friends laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We wandered through the carnival, trying out the games and rides, but everything felt wrong. The games were impossible to win, and the prizes, stuffed animals with vacant eyes and twisted limbs, were more disturbing than enticing. The rides, which should have been exhilarating, felt more like death traps, their rickety structures groaning under the weight of passengers. But it wasn't until we reached the sideshow tent that things took a truly chilling turn. The tent was dark and filled with an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of voices. Performers were unlike anything I'd ever seen. Contortionists whose bodies bent in unnatural ways, fire breathers who seemed to exhale more than just flames, and fortune tellers whose eyes glowed with an unsettling light. The air inside the tent was thick with the scent of incense, and the shadows seemed to move on their own, stretching and shifting as if they were alive. One of the performers, a tall, thin man in a long black coat, approached us. His face was hidden behind a mask, but his voice was smooth and hypnotic. He offered to show us something special, something that only a few had ever seen. My friends, eager for more thrills, agreed, but I hesitated. There was something about the way he spoke, the way his eyes gleamed behind the mask that made my skin crawl. But curiosity got the better of me, and I followed them into the back of the tent. The performer led us to a small, dimly lit room filled with strange artifacts, ancient relics, twisted sculptures, and bizarre contraptions that defied explanation. The center of the room was a large, ornate mirror, its surface covered in swirling patterns that seemed to shift and change as we watched. The performer told us to look into the mirror, promising that it would reveal our deepest fears. My friends laughed, thinking it was just another carnival trick, but I felt a chill run down my spine. One by one, my friends looked into the mirror, their laughter fading as their expressions twisted into horror. They tried to pull away, but something held them there, forcing them to confront whatever they were seeing. When it was my turn, I hesitated, but the performer's voice, smooth and commanding, urged me to step forward. I looked into the mirror, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a reflection. It was a vision, a glimpse into a world of shadows and nightmares. I saw myself trapped in a maze of mirrors, the walls closing in around me, with no way out. The shadows in the mirrors moved, twisting and writhing, taking on monstrous forms that reached out to grab me. The air grew thick with the sound of whispers, haunting, eerie voices that echoed through the maze, taunting me, telling me I would never escape. I tried to pull away. The mirror held me in place, its surface shifting and swirling, drawing me deeper into the nightmare. My heart raced as the shadows closed in, and I could feel the cold touch of their hands on my skin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. I knew I had to get out, but the mirror wouldn't let me go. It was as if it had a life of its own, feeding on my fear, growing stronger with every second. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the performer stepped forward and shattered the mirror with a single touch. The vision disappeared, and I stumbled back, gasping for breath. My friends were in a similar state, their faces pale and their eyes wide with terror. The performer smiled, his mask hiding whatever expression lay beneath, and told us that we had seen enough for one night. We left the carnival in silence, the cheerful lights and music now a haunting reminder of what we had experienced. As we walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the carnival was watching us, that it knew our deepest fears and would never truly let us go. We never spoke of that night again, but the memories still haunt me. The eerie performers, the twisted attractions, and the nightmare in the mirror that almost claimed my soul. Do you ever come across a carnival that seems too mysterious, To unsettling, take my advice. Don't go inside. The thrills it promises are nothing compared to the horrors that lurk beneath the surface. The Carnival of Fear is more than just a place. It's a trap, and once it has you, it may never let you leave. There's something profoundly peaceful about camping in the wilderness, away from the noise and chaos of everyday life. My partner and I had always enjoyed the serenity of nature, and this trip was no different, at least at first. We had chosen a remote spot deep in the forest, far from any roads or trails, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sound of the wind rustling through the leaves. But as night fell, that same wind began to carry something far more chilling. Whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The first night we heard it faintly, just a soft murmur in the distance. We laughed it off, thinking it was just the wind playing tricks on our ears. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. It sounded like voices, multiple voices, speaking in low, urgent tones, though we couldn't make out what they were saying. The sound sent a shiver down my spine, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows. The next day, we tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the wind. The eerie feeling lingered, and as we explored the surrounding forest, couldn't shake the sense that we were being watched. The trees seemed to close in around us, their branches swaying ominously in the breeze. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my nerves on edge. By the time we returned to camp that evening, I was jumpy and anxious. I didn't want to admit it. That night, the whispers returned, louder and clearer than before. This time, it was undeniable. The voices were speaking in a language I didn't recognize, their tone urgent and insistent. My partner heard it too, and we both sat up in our tent, listening intently. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the eerie whispers that seemed to swirl around us, growing louder with each passing moment. The air inside the tent grew cold, and I could feel a presence, something malevolent, lurking just beyond the thin walls of the tent. We decided to investigate, thinking that perhaps someone was playing a prank on us. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped outside, but the moment we did, the whispers stopped. The forest was silent, the darkness pressing in from all sides. We shined our lights into the trees, but there was nothing. No sign of anyone, no movement, nothing but the eerie stillness of the night. We stood there for a long moment, waiting for something to happen. The silence remained unbroken. Reluctantly, we returned to the tent, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whispers again, faint, distant, like they were just out of reach. The air inside the tent felt heavy, oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. I lay there, wide awake, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat until the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees. The next day, we decided to cut the trip short. The peaceful escape we had hoped for had turned into something far more unsettling. Neither of us wanted to spend another night in that place. But as we packed up camp, the whispers returned, this time in broad daylight. They were faint, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. My partner and I exchanged uneasy glances, both of us hearing the same thing. The voices were calling our names. We hurried to finish packing, but the whispers only grew louder, more insistent. It felt like the wind itself was alive, pushing us to leave, yet holding us in place. The trees seemed to lean in closer, their branches swaying in rhythm with the voices. By the time we started hiking back to the car, the whispers had turned into a cacophony of eerie, disembodied voices, all speaking at once, drowning out everything else. As we walked, I could feel the presence following us, something unseen, lurking just beyond the edge of the trail. The whispers never stopped, growing louder and louder until they were all I could hear. My heart raced, and I could feel panic rising in my chest. But I forced myself to keep moving. My partner was just as shaken, and we moved as quickly as we could, desperate to escape whatever was haunting us. When we finally reached the car, the whispers stopped abruptly, leaving behind an eerie silence that was almost worse. We didn't say a word as we drove away, the forest fading into the distance behind us. The memory of those voices, Buried on the Wind still lingers in my mind, haunting, chilling, and impossible to forget. If you ever find yourself camping in a remote area and the wind begins to whisper in a way that doesn't feel right, take my advice. Leave immediately. Some voices are not meant to be heard, and once they find you, they might never let you go. The whispering wind is more than just a breeze. It's a warning, and ignoring it could lead you into a nightmare you'll never escape. As a seasoned treasure hunter, I've encountered my fair share of strange and mysterious items, but nothing prepared me for what I found in that forgotten tomb. The desert was unforgiving, the sun beating down relentlessly as I unearthed the entrance to the ancient crypt. Hidden beneath layers of sand and time, the tomb had been untouched, century, an explorer's dream. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls were covered in faded hieroglyphs, old stories of gods and curses. But what drew my attention most was the artifact. An ornate, intricately carved statue buried deep within the tomb's inner chamber. The moment I laid eyes on it, I knew it was special. The statue was small, no more than a foot tall, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its surface was smooth and polished, yet the carvings were so detailed, they seemed to move in the dim light. I couldn't resist the urge to pick it up, despite the warnings etched into the walls. As soon as my fingers touched the cold stone, a chill ran down my spine, and the air around me seemed to grow colder. At first, I tried to dismiss it as a trick of the mind, product of my excitement and the eerie atmosphere of the tomb. But as I made my way back to camp, strange things began to happen. The desert, which had been scorching just hours before, suddenly felt icy cold, and the wind howled through the dunes with a haunting wail. My equipment malfunctioned, and my compass spun wildly, as if the very earth beneath me was shifting. Back at camp, the unease only grew stronger. That night, as I tried to sleep, I was plagued by nightmares, visions of shadowy figures, twisted and deformed, reaching out for me with skeletal hand. Whispers in the dark were relentless, calling my name, taunting me with secrets I couldn't understand. I woke drenched in sweat, artifacts still clutched in my hands, and a deep sense of dread settled in my chest. Following days were a blur of fear and confusion. Everywhere I went, strange occurrences followed. Objects moved on their own, shadows stretched unnaturally long, and the air was thick with an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on me from all sides. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, stalked by something unseen, something that had been awakened the moment I touched the artifact. Desperate to break free from the curse, I researched the history of the tomb and its warnings. The hieroglyphs told a chilling tale. A powerful entity had been sealed within the statue, bound by ancient magic to protect the world from its wrath. The warnings were clear. Whoever disturbed the artifact would be cursed, hunted by the vengeful spirit until their soul was claimed. Determined to rid myself of the curse, I sought out experts in ancient rituals and curses, hoping they could help me undo the damage. But no matter where I turned, the answer was always the same. Curse could not be broken. The only way to escape its grasp was to return the artifact to its rightful place and perform a ritual to reseal the entity within it. The thought of returning to the tomb filled me with dread, but I knew I had no choice. The journey back to the tomb was grueling, the weight of the curse growing heavier with each step. The desert seemed to conspire against me, the wind howling in my ears, the sand shifting beneath my feet. By the time I reached the tomb, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. But I couldn't let the fear stop me. I had to finish what I started. Inside the tomb, the air was even colder than before, and the shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I placed the artifact back on its pedestal, reciting the ancient incantation I had learned. The words felt foreign on my tongue, but as I spoke them, the air around me seemed to vibrate with energy. The shadows writhed and twisted, and the temperature plummeted, but I kept going, desperate to seal the entity away. As I finished the ritual, a deafening silence fell over the tomb. The oppressive weight lifted, and the air grew still. The statue remained on its pedestal, its surface once again smooth and unmoving, as if nothing had ever happened. The curse had been lifted, but the memory of those days still haunts me. Chilling nightmares, eerie whispers, and the constant feeling of being hunted. I left the tomb that day, vowing never to return. The artifact remains where it belongs, hidden away from the world, but the experience changed me. You ever find yourself in possession of something ancient and mysterious? Take my advice. Leave it where you found it. Some things are better left buried, and the cost of disturbing them can be far more than you're willing to pay. The curse is real, and once it has you in its grasp, it won't let go easily. Camping in the heart of the forest has always been my escape, an opportunity to disconnect from the world and reconnect with nature. So when a group of friends suggested a weekend trip to a remote campsite, I was all in. The spot was secluded, miles from the nearest road, surrounded by towering trees and the sound of the wind whispering through the branches. It was perfect, or so we thought. The area had a dark history, one that the locals still whispered about. Decades ago, a woodsman had mysteriously vanished near an old logging site, and rumors of his vengeful spirit still lingered in the town nearby. We set up camp near the site, oblivious to the warning. The day was peaceful, hiking, fishing, and enjoying the serenity of the forest. But as night fell, the atmosphere changed. The air grew colder, and the forest, which had been alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves, felt eerily silent. A heavy fog rolled in, wrapping around the trees like a shroud, and the moon cast long, haunting shadows on the ground. That night, we gathered around the campfire, telling ghost stories and laughing off the creeping sense of unease. But as the fire crackled and the night deepened, we heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound echoing through the trees. It was the unmistakable sound of an axe chopping wood. At first, we thought it might be another camper nearby. But as the minutes passed, the sound grew louder, closer, and more deliberate. The eerie cadence of the chopping filled the air, and a chill ran down my spine. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the wind, but the tension was palpable. The sound of the axe never stopped, and it felt as though the darkness itself was pressing in on us, heavy and suffocating. The fire, once warm and comforting, now seemed small and insignificant against the vast eerie forest that surrounded us. We sat in silence, listening to the relentless chopping, until one of my friends suggested we check it out. Reluctantly, we grabbed our flashlights and ventured into the trees, following the sound. Fog thickened as we moved deeper into the forest, and the trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The sound of the axe echoed through the night, but no matter how far we walked, we couldn't seem to find the source. It was as if the woods themselves were playing tricks on us, leading us in circles. Just when we were about to give up and head back to camp, we stumbled upon an old clearing. In the center stood a massive weathered tree stump, evidence of the long-abandoned logging site. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the ground around the stump was littered with old, rusted tools. But what caught our attention most was the axe, embedded deep in the stump, its blade gleaming in the pale moonlight. The moment we saw it, chopping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. My friends stood frozen, their eyes locked on the axe as if they couldn't look away. The air grew colder, and a sense of dread settled over us, heavy and unshakable. It was then that we realized we were not alone. A shadowy figure emerged from the fog, tall and imposing, with an axe in hand. His features were obscured by the darkness, but there was no mistaking the malevolent energy that radiated from him. He moved with a slow, deliberate gait, the eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, fixed on us. The air around him seemed to warp and twist, and the temperature plummeted, leaving our breath visible in the cold night air. Panic surged through us, and we bolted back toward camp, the sound of footsteps and the chopping of the axe following close behind. Forest seemed to conspire against us, the fog thickening and the trees twisting in ways that made it nearly impossible to find our way. My heart raced as I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure looming behind us, but all I could see were shadows shifting in the mist. When we finally burst through the trees and back into our campsite, fire had nearly gone out, casting long, eerie shadows across the clearing. The chopping had stopped, but the oppressive presence lingered, heavy and suffocating. We quickly packed up our gear, not daring to stay another moment. As we drove away, the forest receded into the distance, but the memory of that night stayed with us, chilling, haunting, and impossible to forget. If you ever find yourself camping near an old logging site, take my advice. Listen to the locals' warnings. The woods may seem peaceful during the day, but when night falls, the past can come back to haunt you. The woodsman may have vanished, but his spirit remains, and once you hear the sound of his axe, it's already too late. Kayaking down a remote river has always been one of my favorite ways to escape the noise of the world. There's something peaceful about the steady rhythm of the paddle, the quiet ripple of water, and the untouched beauty of the wilderness. But during one particular trip, that peace was shattered by something far more sinister. It was supposed to be a simple journey, just me, my kayak, and the river, winding through dense forests and rugged terrain. But what I found on that river still haunts me to this day. The river was calm that day, the water smooth as glass, reflecting the dense canopy of trees overhead. The only sounds were the gentle splash of my paddle and the occasional call of a bird from the forest. But as I rounded a bend, I noticed something strange. A canoe, old and weathered, floating aimlessly down the river. It was half submerged, its paint peeling and wood splintering, with no sign of its owner. Curious, I paddled closer, my heart quickening with unease. The canoe was empty, save for a few tattered belongings, a moldy blanket, a rusted lantern, and a waterlogged journal. The sight of it sent a chill down my spine. There was something eerie about the way it drifted, as if it were being guided by an unseen hand. I felt a strange compulsion to follow it, as if the river itself was urging me to uncover its secret. Without fully understanding why, I paddled after the canoe, letting it lead me upstream. The river grew narrower as I followed the canoe, the trees closing in on either side, casting long, eerie shadows over the water. The air grew colder, and a heavy mist began to settle over the river, obscuring my view. But I kept going, driven by a sense of curiosity and dread. The farther I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became, as if the very air was thick with the weight of the past. Eventually, the canoe drifted toward the shore, coming to rest against the muddy bank. I followed suit, pulling my kayak up onto the land and stepping into the dense undergrowth. Forest was deathly quiet. Only sound the faint rustle of leaves in the wind. But there was something else. Faint, rhythmic noise, like the sound of water dripping on stone. It seemed to be coming from deeper within the woods, and with a mix of fear and fascination, I followed the sound. The trees grew thicker as I pushed through the undergrowth, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the sun. The ground was soft and marshy, each step sinking slightly into the mud. The dripping sound grew louder, more insistent, until I came upon a clearing. At its center was a small, overgrown village, its buildings crumbling and half submerged in the marshy ground. The sight of it sent a shiver down my spine, for it looked as if the village had been swallowed by the earth itself. I stepped into the clearing, the air thick with the scent of decay. The buildings were old, their wood rotting and their roofs caved in, as if they had been abandoned for decades. But there was something else, something darker. The ground around the village was littered with bones, half buried in the mud, their bleached white surfaces gleaming in the dim light. The sight of them made my stomach churn, and I realized with a sinking feeling that this village had not simply been abandoned. It had been destroyed. As I explored the village, the sense of unease grew stronger. The dripping sound I had heard earlier was coming from an old well at the center of the clearing, its stone walls covered in moss and lichen. The water inside was dark and stagnant, but as I peered over the edge, I saw something glinting at the bottom, something metal. Without thinking, I reached down and pulled it out. It was a rusted locket, its chain broken, and as I held it in my hand, a wave of cold washed over me. Suddenly, the air around me grew thick with the sound of whispers, haunting, eerie voices that seemed to come from the very ground beneath my feet. The trees around the clearing swayed in a wind I couldn't feel, their branches creaking and groaning as if they were alive. I felt a presence, something malevolent, something ancient, rising from the earth itself, and I knew I had to get out of there. I ran back to my kayak, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, as I fled. The forest seemed to close in around me, the shadows stretching and twisting as if trying to trap me. By the time I reached the river, I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. I pushed off from the shore, paddling furiously downstream, desperate to escape the haunting presence that followed me. When I finally reached safety, I looked back at the river, half expecting to see the village disappear into the mist. But there was nothing, just the silent, eerie stretch of water, winding its way through the forest. The memory of that day still lingers with me. The abandoned canoe, the cursed village, and the haunting whispers that seemed to echo from the very earth itself. If you ever find yourself kayaking down a remote river and you come across something that doesn't belong, take my advice. Leave it be. The river holds secrets that are better left undiscovered, and once you've heard its whispers, you might not escape with your sanity intact. Urban exploration has always been a thrill for me. The excitement of venturing into forgotten places, uncovering secrets left behind by time. So when I heard about an old amusement park that had been closed for decades, couldn't resist the urge to check it out. The park was hidden away on the outskirts of town, its gates rusting and overgrown with vines. From the moment I stepped through the entrance, I felt a chilling sense of unease, as if the park was watching me, waiting for me to uncover its dark secret. The rides stood silent and still, their once vibrant colors faded and peeling. The Ferris wheel loomed above the park like a skeletal giant, its rusted metal creaking in the wind. Carousel, once full of music and laughter, was now a haunting relic, painted horses frozen in mid-gallop. As I wandered through the park, eerie atmosphere pressed in on me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The deeper I ventured into the park, the more unsettling it became. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with debris, broken bottles, old tickets, and faded signs that once beckoned visitors to step right up. But there was something else too, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the park was alive, its rusting rides and crumbling attractions pulsing with a dark energy that seemed to seep into my bones. I wasn't the only one who felt it. My friends who had joined me on this adventure were unnervingly quiet, their usual banter replaced by uneasy glances and whispered conversations. We all felt it, that chilling presence lurking just out of sight, watching our every move. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the park. And as the light faded, the sense of dread only grew stronger. We decided to check out the old funhouse, its entrance flanked by two grotesque clown statues with chipped paint and unsettling grins. The door creaked as we pushed it open, and the air inside was stale and musty, thick with the scent of rot. The mirrors inside were cracked and dirty, their surfaces distorted, reflecting warped versions of ourselves. As we made our way through the dark, twisting corridors, the unsettling feeling intensified. It wasn't long before we started hearing things, faint whispers, distant laughter, the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. At first, we thought it was just the wind, or maybe our minds playing tricks on us. But the sounds grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls themselves were closing in on us. My heart raced as we moved deeper into the funhouse, each step taking us further from the safety of the outside world. Then, we heard it, a distant, eerie melody, like the sound of a carnival organ playing a haunting tune. It echoed through the darkened halls, growing louder with each passing moment. The laughter we had heard before returned, but this time it was closer, more menacing. The funhouse seemed to twist and warp around us, the mirrors reflecting not just our own images, but shadowy figures that darted in and out of view. Panic set in, and we decided to leave the funhouse, but the exit wasn't where we had left it. The corridors twisted and turned in ways that made no sense, leading us deeper into the maze of mirrors and shadows. Eerie music followed us, growing louder and more discordant, and the laughter became a chorus of voices, mocking us, taunting us. My friends and I stumbled through the dark, desperate to find our way out. But the funhouse had become a labyrinth, a nightmare that refused to let us go. Finally, after what felt like hours, we burst through a door and into the open air. The park was silent once more, eerie music and laughter gone. The sense of dread lingered. We didn't speak as we made our way back to the entrance, our footsteps echoing through the empty park. The sun had long since set, and the shadows stretched out like dark fingers, reaching for us as we hurried away. As we left the park, I glanced back at the funhouse, half expecting to see someone or something standing in the doorway, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just the silent, rusting rides in the darkened buildings, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to wander inside. The memory of that night still haunts me, the eerie music, the mocking laughter, and the unsettling feeling that we had disturbed something that should have been left alone. If you ever find yourself tempted to explore an abandoned amusement park, take my advice. Don't go in. The park may seem empty, but it's not. Waiting, and once you step inside, it may never let you leave. The rusting rides and broken attractions are more than just relics of the past. They're a gateway to something far more chilling, something that feeds on the fear of those who dare to enter. There's something both peaceful and terrifying about being snowbound in a remote cabin. The isolation, the silence, the world outside blanketed in white. It can feel like a dream or a nightmare, depending on your perspective. For my group of friends, it started as a dream. We had rented a cozy cabin deep in the mountains for a weekend getaway, far from the chaos of daily life. First day was perfect. Snowshoeing through the woods, warming up by the fire, and laughing over mugs of hot cocoa. But as the snowstorm rolled in and the cabin became more isolated, the atmosphere began to shift. Peacefulness gave way to a creeping sense of unease. By the second night, that unease turned into something far more chilling. Snow came down hard, piling up against the windows and burying the world outside. We were trapped, cut off from the rest of the world, but none of us were too concerned at first. We had plenty of food, firewood, and entertainment. But as the storm raged on, the power flickered and then went out completely, plunging the cabin into darkness. The only light came from the fireplace, casting eerie shadows on the walls. It was then that one of my friends found the old journal hidden in a drawer. A journal that would change everything. The journal belonged to the previous occupants of the cabin, a family who had stayed there many years ago. At first, the entries were mundane, descriptions of their daily activities, notes about the weather, plans for their time in the mountain. But as we read on, tones shifted. The family had become trapped in a snowstorm, just like us. And as the days went on, strange things began to happen. Father wrote of hearing whispers in the night, shadows moving outside the cabin, a growing sense of dread that seemed to seep into the very walls. We laughed nervously, dismissing it as the ramblings of someone driven mad by isolation. But as the storm outside intensified, the eerie events described in the journal started happening to us. That night, we heard the whispers, soft, indistinct voices carried on the wind, though there was no one outside. The shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch and shift, twisting into shapes that didn't belong. The air grew colder, even with the fire blazing, and a heavy weight of unease settled over us. None of us slept that night. We huddled by the fire, trying to keep the darkness at bay, but the whispers continued, growing louder and more insistent. The journal described similar experiences. The family had tried to leave the cabin, but the snow was too deep, and something was out there, watching them, waiting. The entries became more frantic, more desperate, as the father described seeing figures in the snow, pale, shadowy shapes that moved silently through the storm. He warned that the cabin was cursed, that something malevolent lurked in the mountains, drawn to the isolation and the cold. By the next morning, the storm had worsened. The snow was piled high against the door, and we knew there was no way out. The tension in the cabin was palpable, and we were all on edge, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. every gust of wind that rattled the windows. The journal's final entries were scrawled and barely legible. Father's handwriting, shaky and desperate, he wrote of his family disappearing one by one, taken by the figures in the snow. The last entry simply read, "They're here." That night, the whispers became deafening. The shadows in the cabin seemed to come alive, writhing and twisting in the corners of the room. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and we could feel the presence of something outside, something that had been waiting for us. We barricaded the door and windows, but it felt like a futile effort. The temperature plummeted, and the fire struggled to stay lit, as if the cold itself was seeping into the cabin. As the night wore on, we began to see them, the figures in the snow. At first, they were just glimpses, pale shapes moving through the storm. But as the hours passed, they drew closer, their outlines becoming more defined. They were tall and thin, their faces obscured by the snow, but their eyes, cold, empty voids, seemed to pierce through the darkness. We tried to convince ourselves that it was just our imagination, but deep down we knew the truth. Figures were real, and they were coming for us. We spent the rest of the night in terror, huddled together as the figures circled the cabin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to lure us outside. We could hear the sound of footsteps crunching in the snow, growing closer and closer, until they were right outside the door. The doorknob rattled, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay. It was then that we knew we were no longer alone. When morning finally came, the storm had passed, leaving the world outside eerily silent. The figures were gone, but the memory of that night still haunts us. We left the cabin as quickly as we could, never looking back. The journal, the whispers, the figures in the snow, they're all part of a nightmare we can't forget. If you ever find yourself trapped in a snowbound cabin during a storm, take my advice. Don't ignore the signs. The cold can do more than chill your bones. It can bring something far more chilling to your door. There's something eerie about diving in a man-made lake, knowing that beneath the calm surface lies a sunken world, lost to time. I've always been fascinated by such places, so when I had the chance to explore a submerged village at the bottom of a remote reservoir, I couldn't resist. The village had been flooded decades ago when a dam was built, and it was said that the entire community had been swallowed by the rising water. But what the stories didn't mention were the dark secrets that had been buried with it, and the restless spirits that still lingered below. The day of the dive was clear and calm, the water smooth as glass. My dive partner and I geared up, eager to explore the ruins hidden beneath the lake. As we descended into the cold, dark water, the world above faded away, and the village slowly came into view. It was an eerie sight, houses, streets, and even a church, all perfectly preserved, as if time had stopped the moment the water rushed in. But there was something unsettling about it, too. The silence was oppressive, and the deeper we went, the darker the water became, until it felt like we were swimming through shadows. As we swam through the village, the weight of the water pressing down on us couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The houses loomed out of the darkness, their windows empty and black, like eyes staring back at us. The streets were choked with silt and debris, and the once vibrant village now felt more like a graveyard. My dive partner seemed to sense it too. He kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to see someone or something following us. We explored the sunken ruins for a while, marveling at how well everything had been preserved. But as we moved deeper into the village, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The water seemed to grow colder, and the light from our dive lamps barely cut through the thick, murky water. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the old building settling in the silt. It was then that I noticed something strange. Faint, rhythmic sound, the tolling of a distant bell. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the church, a small, stone building that had once stood at the center of the village. The bell tower was still intact, its steeple jutting up into the water like a skeletal finger pointing toward the surface. My dive partner and I exchanged uneasy glances, but curiosity got the better of us, and we swam toward the church. Inside, the water was thick with silt, and the light from our dive lamps barely illuminated the dark, cramped space. The pews were still in place, covered in a thin layer of algae, and the altar stood at the far end of the room, draped in shadows. The sound of the bell was louder now, resonating through the water, though there was no visible movement in the tower above. It was as if the bell was tolling on its own, calling out from the depths of the past. As we moved deeper into the church, the water grew colder, and I could feel a heavy presence pressing in on us, like we were being watched by unseen eyes. My dive partner suddenly stopped, pointing toward the altar. There, draped in the shadows, was a figure, a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. The figure moved, its form twisting and writhing as if struggling against the water. Panic surged through me, and I signaled to my dive partner that we needed to leave. But as we turned to go, the figure moved closer, its shape becoming more defined. It was a woman, or what had once been a woman, her face pale and bloated, her eyes dark and empty. She reached out toward us, her movements slow and deliberate, and the water around us grew colder still, thick with the scent of decay. We swam as fast as we could, the water resisting our every move, as if trying to hold us back. The bell continued to toll, louder and more insistent, as the figure followed us, her hollow eyes fixed on us. My heart raced, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest, but I forced myself to keep moving, desperate to reach the surface. The village seemed to twist and warp around us, the once familiar streets now a disorienting maze of shadows and debris. When we finally broke the surface, gasping for air, the oppressive weight lifted. The memory of what we had seen lingered. We quickly climbed back into the boat, our hands trembling as we removed our gear. The lake was calm once more, the surface undisturbed, but we both knew that what we had encountered was real. The drowned village was more than just a forgotten relic. It was a place where the dead still lingered, their souls trapped beneath the water, seeking revenge for the lives they had lost. Do you ever find yourself diving in a lake that hides a forgotten past? Take my advice. Tread carefully. The water may seem calm, but beneath the surface lies a world of darkness and despair, where the past refuses to stay buried. The drowned village is a place of secrets, and those who disturb it may find themselves pulled under, never to return. When we first moved into the old house, we were enchanted by its charm. High ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows that let in plenty of light. It had been standing for over a century, a historic home with a storied past. The previous owners had taken good care of it, and despite its age, felt welcoming. But it wasn't long before we noticed something strange. There was a shadow on the wall in the hallway, a dark outline that didn't match any of the furniture or fixtures in the house. At first, we brushed it off as a quirk of the old home, but the shadow seemed to have a life of its own. The shadow was always there, even when the light shifted or the sun moved across the sky. It was an odd, angular shape, almost like a person standing just out of sight. We tried everything, rearranging the furniture, checking for hidden objects, even painting the wall. The shadow never went away. It stayed in the same spot, as if it were burned into the very fabric of the house. At first, it was easy to ignore. It was just a shadow, after all. But as the days passed, it became harder to dismiss. The shadow seemed to move ever so slightly, changing its shape and position when we weren't looking. It would grow longer or shorter, its edges blurring and sharpening as if it were alive. We began to feel uneasy in the house, as if we were being watched by something we couldn't see. One night, as we were sitting in the living room, we heard a strange noise coming from the hallway. It was a soft, shuffling sound, like someone was walking slowly down the hall. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced at the shadow on the wall, which seemed to have grown darker, more defined. I tried to tell myself it was just the creaking of the old house, but the sound continued, growing louder, until it was right outside the living room door. We sat frozen, listening to the footsteps that shouldn't have been there. When the sound stopped, I gathered the courage to check the hallway. But it was empty, except for the shadow. It had moved, now stretching down the wall as if it were reaching for the door. The air felt thick, oppressive, and a cold draft swept through the house, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The strange occurrences didn't stop there. Objects in the house began to move on their own. Books falling off shelves, doors opening and closing by themselves, lights flickering without reason. The shadow on the wall seemed to grow stronger with each passing day, presence more palpable. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It felt like something more, something that was trying to communicate with us. Or worse, trying to take something from us. We started having nightmares. Dark, disturbing dreams that left us waking up in a cold sweat. In the dreams, the shadow would move closer, reaching out with tendrils of darkness, trying to pull us into its world. The feeling of dread that followed us during the day now seeped into our nights, making it impossible to find peace. The house, once warm and inviting, had become a place of fear. Desperate for answers, we reached out to a local historian who knew the history of the house. What we learned chilled us to the bone. Decades ago, a tragic event had taken place in the home. A man had lost his life under mysterious circumstances. His death never fully explained. The historian mentioned that strange occurrences had been reported by previous owners, though none had stayed long enough to uncover the truth. Determined to understand what was happening, we began to investigate further. We discovered old records, newspaper clippings, and personal letters that painted a picture of the man's life. He had been deeply troubled, obsessed with the idea that he was being watched by something sinister. In his final days, he had written about a shadow that followed him everywhere, a presence that grew stronger until it consumed him. The more we read, the more we realized that the shadow on our wall wasn't just a quirk of the old house. It was a manifestation of the man's torment, a lingering echo of his suffering. The final piece of the puzzle came when we found an old journal hidden in the attic. The man's last entries were scrawled and frantic, describing how the shadow had begun to take on a life of its own, controlling his thoughts and action. He believed that the shadow was trying to take his soul, and in the end, he succumbed to its influence, leaving behind only the dark stain on the wall as a reminder of his torment. Armed with this knowledge, we knew we had to act. We sought out help from a spiritual expert who guided us through a cleansing ritual to rid the house of the lingering presence. It wasn't easy. The air in the house seemed to resist our efforts, and the shadow fought back, growing darker and more menacing. But after hours of chanting, prayers, and burning sage, the oppressive feeling finally lifted. The shadow faded, and the house felt lighter, as if a great weight had been lifted from its walls. Since that night, the shadow on the wall has not returned. The house is peaceful once more, and we've been able to move on from the unsettling experience. But the memory of that shadow still lingers in the back of our minds, a haunting reminder of the darkness that can sometimes cling to a place. If you ever move into an old house and notice something that doesn't seem right, whether it's a shadow on the wall or a feeling you can't shake, trust your instinct. The past has a way of reaching out to the present, and sometimes it leaves a mark that's impossible to erase. When you think of a tropical island vacation, you imagine white sandy beaches, crystal clear waters, and a peaceful escape from reality. That's exactly what we had in mind when a group of us decided to spend a week on a remote island far from the bustling tourist spot. The island was small, barely a dot on the map, a single village and a handful of locals. It seemed like the perfect getaway, until we realized that the island held dark secrets that would soon turn our paradise into a living nightmare. From the moment we arrived, there was something off about them. The locals were friendly enough, but there was a strange tension in the air, as if they were hiding something. The village was small and quaint, traditional huts and a serene beach, but there were areas the villagers warned us not to explore, particularly the dense jungle at the heart of the island. They spoke in hushed tones about ancient rituals and dark traditions, but we dismissed it as nothing more than local folklore. First few days were idyllic, sunbathing on the beach, snorkeling in the crystal-clear waters, and exploring the island's beautiful coastline. But as the week went on, we began to notice strange things. The locals grew more distant, their friendly smiles fading into guarded glances. At night, we heard strange noises coming from the jungle, low, rhythmic chanting, and the sound of drums echoing through the trees. The air grew thick with an eerie tension, and the once welcoming island began to feel more like a prison. On the fourth night, we decided to investigate. Curiosity got the better of us, and despite the villagers' warnings, we ventured into the jungle. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches blocking out the moonlight. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and the air was thick, the scent of smoke, and something else, something rotten, like decaying flesh. We stumbled upon a clearing deep in the jungle, lit by the flickering flames of torches. In the center stood a stone altar, stained with what looked like dried blood. The villagers were gathered around it, their faces hidden behind grotesque masks, their bodies swaying to the rhythm of the drums. They were performing some kind of ritual, and it quickly became clear that we were not supposed to be there. Air was thick with a chilling energy, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Before we could retreat, the villagers noticed us. Their chanting stopped abruptly, and they turned toward us as one, their eyes, those that weren't hidden behind masks, filled with a dark, unsettling intensity. For a moment, we stood frozen in fear, and then one of them stepped forward, raising a ceremonial knife. The air was charged with tension, and I knew we had to get out of there before it was too late. We bolted back through the jungle, the sound of drums and footsteps echoing behind us. The once beautiful island now felt like a twisted labyrinth, the jungle seeming to close in and twist around us, making it difficult to find our way back. My heart raced as we stumbled through the underbrush, every snap of a twig sending a jolt of fear through my body. The chanting had resumed, but it was no longer distant. It was all around us, closing in from every direction. When we finally reached the beach, the village was eerily silent. The hut stood dark and empty, as if the villagers had vanished. The only sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against the shore, but the sense of dread remained. We quickly packed our things, desperate to leave the island. As we made our way to the boat, we found it gone, vanished without a trace. We were stranded, trapped on the island with no way to escape. Following days were a blur of fear and desperation. We tried to signal for help, but the island was too remote and no one came. At night, chanting and drumming continued, growing louder and more frantic, as if the island itself was alive with some dark energy. We barely slept, too afraid of what might happen if we let our guard down. The once friendly villagers became our unseen tormentors. Their presence felt but never seen, as if they were watching us from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. On the last night, the drums and chanting reached a fever pitch. We huddled together, terrified and exhausted, knowing that whatever ritual the villagers were performing was coming to a climax. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and the island seemed to vibrate with dark energy. Just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, the noise suddenly stopped, leaving behind an eerie silence that was almost worse. At dawn, a boat appeared on the horizon, a small fishing vessel, seemingly unaware of the island's dark history. We signaled frantically, and the fishermen took us aboard, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern as we told them our story. We didn't look back as we left the island, the jungle receding into the distance. But the memory of that place still haunts me. The isolated island had seemed like paradise, but it hid a darkness that we could never have imagined. If you ever find yourself on a remote island where the locals seem too secretive and the jungle seems to pulse with a life of its own, take my advice. Leave before it's too late. The beauty of the island can hide its true nature, and once you uncover its secrets, it may never let you go. Late-night commutes have always had a certain quiet charm, the world outside rushing by in darkness, the gentle rocking of the train lulling you into a peaceful state. But there's a fine line between peace and unease, and one night I found myself on the wrong side of that line. I had boarded a late-night train after a long day at work, eager to get home and rest. The platform had been almost empty, and as I stepped onto the train, I noticed something strange. It was eerily quiet, too quiet. Kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. The train car was empty, no other passengers in sight. At first, I was relieved. An empty train meant a peaceful ride home, a chance to close my eyes and relax. But as the train pulled out of the station and into the night, a sense of unease began to settle over me. The train was moving faster than usual, the lights outside blurring into streaks of color. The gentle rocking that I found comforting on most nights now felt disorienting, almost unnatural. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on my mind. But the longer I sat there, the stronger the feeling of unease became. I glanced around the car, searching for any sign of life. There was none. The train seemed to stretch on forever, an endless row of empty seats and flickering lights. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks. Something wasn't right. As the train sped through the night, I began to notice something else. There were no stops, no familiar stations flashing by, no announcements over the intercom, no signs that the train was headed anywhere I recognized. The windows showed only darkness, an endless void that seemed to swallow the train whole. I checked the time and my heart skipped a beat. Hours had passed, yet it felt like no time at all. The train wasn't just moving fast, it was moving through something else entirely, something beyond the world I knew. Panic began to creep in. I stood up, deciding to move to another car, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could explain what was happening. But as I made my way down the aisle, I realized with growing dread, every car was the same. Empty, silent, and flickering with dim, ghostly light. The train felt like a haunted relic, a vessel moving through the night with no destination, no purpose. I tried to open the doors between the cars, but they were locked. No matter how hard I pulled or pushed, it wouldn't budge. The train was sealing me in, trapping me in this endless journey to nowhere. My breath came in short, panicked gasps as I banged on the doors, shouting for help. There was no response. The train just kept moving, faster and faster, the outside world a blur of darkness and shadows. As I sat back down, defeated, I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. A figure barely visible in the reflection of the window. It was there one moment, gone the next, as if it were a shadow that had come to life. I spun around, but the car was still empty. My heart raced, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. The figure appeared again, closer this time, its outline just visible in the dim light. It was watching me, I realized, and the realization sent a chill down my spine. The figure grew more distinct with each passing moment, and soon, I could see it clearly. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face pale and expressionless. He stood at the far end of the car, his eyes locked on mine, unblinking and cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to tear my gaze away from him. The train seemed to slow as he moved closer, his footsteps echoing in the empty car. I tried to speak, to ask him who he was, but the words caught in my throat. He said nothing as he approached, his eyes boring into mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. When he finally stopped in front of me, he leaned in close, his voice a low whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "You're on the wrong train," he said, breath cold against my cheek. "You don't belong here." Before I could react, the train lurched to a sudden stop. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the car into darkness. For a moment there was only silence, thick and suffocating. Then the doors opened with a hiss, and I felt a rush of cold air. I stumbled out of the train, my legs shaking, and found myself standing on an empty platform. The train pulled away behind me, disappearing into the night as if it had never been there. The platform was deserted, the station unfamiliar. I looked around, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. There were no signs, no indication of where I was or how I had gotten there. My phone had no signal, and the clock on the wall showed a time that made no sense. Hours had passed, yet it felt like only minutes. I stood there, alone in the eerie silence, my heart still racing. To this day, I don't know where that train took me or how I ended up back in the real world. But I do know one thing. I'll never take the late-night train again. If you ever find yourself on a train that doesn't feel quite right, take my advice. Get off at the next stop, no matter where it is. Some trains aren't meant for this world, and if you stay on board too long, you might find yourself on a journey you can't return from. I've always loved the solitude of the Utah wilderness, where the only noise is the wind rustling through the pines. That's why, one chilly autumn evening, I found myself nestled inside my tent, miles away from civilization. The day had been peaceful, just me, my thoughts, and the breathtaking beauty of nature. But as night fell, a strange feeling began to settle over the campsite, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, out of the darkness, I heard it. Whispers, low and indistinct, floating just outside my tent. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakably eerie, sending chills down my spine. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was all in my head, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The feeling of being watched was almost unbearable, and every fiber of my being screamed for me to stay inside the tent. Yet curiosity, or perhaps fear, got the best of me. I slowly unzipped the tent, peering into the inky blackness beyond the thin fabric. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that made my ears ring. My flashlight cut through the dark, revealing only the familiar shapes of trees and bushes. But then, just as I began to relax, I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the clearing, his figure barely visible in the shadows. He was too still, too quiet, and something about him was off. I called out, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned and walked deeper into the woods, his movements deliberate and unsettling. My heart pounded in my chest as I debated whether to follow him. Felt like every horror story I'd ever heard was coming to life right before my eyes. But I couldn't just let it go. Grabbing my flashlight and knife, I cautiously followed his trail, eerie silence pressing in on me from all sides. The forest seemed to close in around me as I walked, the trees casting long, haunting shadows across the ground. I followed the faint sound of crunching leaves, but every time I thought I was getting closer, he would vanish from sight. It was like the woods were playing tricks on me, distorting time and space in a way that made no sense. Finally, I stumbled upon a small clearing where his figure had vanished, and what I found there sent shivers down my spine. The man's campsite was there, just as I'd expected, but it was wrong. The fire pit was cold, the tent empty, and yet everything seemed freshly used, as if he'd just been there moments before. But there were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no evidence of anyone packing up and leaving. It was as if he had simply disappeared. The air around the site felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the area with my flashlight, every rustle of leaves making my heart race. The whispers returned, this time closer, circling me like a predator toying with its prey. Panic set in as I realized that whatever was out there, it wasn't human. The eerie atmosphere was so thick that it was hard to breathe, and I knew I had to get out of there before something terrible happened. But as I turned to leave, I felt a presence right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the dark. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. I bolted back toward my tent, every snap of a twig sending shockwaves through my nerves. The whispers followed me, growing louder, more insistent, as if they were trying to drag me back to that cursed campsite. I barely made it back to my tent, collapsing inside with my heart pounding in my throat. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too terrified to close my eyes. The whispers eventually faded. The eerie feeling lingered, like a stain on the very air I was breathing. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I packed up as fast as I could and got the hell out of there. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in the safety of my car, where the horror of the night felt like a distant nightmare. To this day, I can't explain what happened out there in the Utah wilderness. The rational part of me wants to believe it was just my imagination. Deep down, I know better. There was something out there, something chilling, something not of this world. And though I may never understand it, I'll never forget the terror I felt in those woods, and the haunting whispers that still echo in my mind. Exploring abandoned places had always been a thrilling hobby of mine, but nothing could have prepared me for the chilling experience inside the old asylum. The building loomed over us, its windows shattered, walls scarred by time. My friends and I had heard the stories, the eerie rumors of the twisted experiments that took place within its walls. But curiosity got the best of us, and we couldn't resist the temptation to see for ourselves. As we stepped inside, the air grew cold, and the silence was deafening, broken only by the creaking of the decaying structure. The deeper we ventured into the asylum, the more unsettling it became. Graffiti-covered walls whispered of the horrors that once occurred there, and the lingering stench of mildew mixed with something more sinister, something that sent shivers down my spine. We found old medical equipment scattered around, rusted and forgotten, like remnants of a dark past. It was then that I started to notice it. Faint sound of footsteps echoing down the hallways, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. It wasn't long before the shadows began to play tricks on us. At first, it seemed like nothing, just the eerie atmosphere getting to our heads. But then, the shapes started to move, darting in and out of the corners of our vision. My friends and I exchanged uneasy glances, but no one wanted to be the first to suggest leaving. We pressed on, deeper into the heart of the asylum, where the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. That's when we stumbled upon the room. It was an operating room, or at least it had been. The rusted bed in the center was still bolted to the floor, and surgical tools lay scattered on the dirty tiles. The walls were covered in old, yellowing papers, documents detailing the horrifying experiments conducted on the patient. My stomach churned as I read the descriptions, my mind reeling at the thought of the suffering that had taken place here. But what caught my attention most was the name scrawled repeatedly on the walls: Dr. Caldwell. As we stood there, absorbing the horror of the room, the temperature suddenly dropped. I could see my breath in front of me, and the eerie feeling of being watched grew unbearable. Then, from the shadows, a low, guttural voice echoed through the room. Soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone, or something, was trying to communicate with us. Panic set in as we realized we were not alone. We bolted out of the room, our footsteps echoing through the empty hallways as we tried to find our way back to the entrance. But the asylum seemed to have a mind of its own, twisting and turning, leading us deeper into its bowels. The footsteps behind us grew louder, closer, and every now and then we caught glimpses of movement in the darkness, shapes that didn't belong to us. My heart raced as we turned corner after corner, only to find ourselves more lost than before. In our desperation, we stumbled upon a stairwell that led down into the basement. It was a mistake, terrible mistake. The basement was even more unsettling than the rest of the asylum, with its damp walls and flickering lights. As we descended, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, until they formed words. "You shouldn't be here," the voice said, echoing off the cold concrete walls. I froze in terror, my mind screaming for us to turn back. But there was no other way out. Down in the basement, we found rows of old cells, tiny, windowless rooms where patients had been kept in isolation. The doors were heavy, rusted shut, but inside, we could see remnants of the lives that had been trapped there. Scratches on the walls, old mattresses, and unsettling stains on the floor. The air was thick with the feeling of despair, and I could feel eyes on me, watching, waiting. That's when we heard it. The sound of metal scraping against metal, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. We turned to see one of the cell doors slowly creaking open, and from within, a shadowy figure began to emerge. It was tall, its movements jerky and unnatural, and as it stepped into the dim light, I could see its hollow eyes fixed on us. We didn't wait to see what it would do. We ran, faster than we'd ever run before, the terror driving us forward as the asylum seemed to close in around us. The footsteps followed, relentless, echoing off the walls as if the very building was alive, chasing us. Somehow, we made it back to the entrance, bursting through the doors and into the cold night air. We didn't stop running until we reached our cars, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we tried to make sense of what had just happened. None of us spoke a word as we drove away, too shaken by the experience to even look back. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed us out of that asylum, something that still haunts me to this day. I've never gone back to that place, and I never will. The memories of what we saw and what we felt are enough to keep me far away. Some places are better left undisturbed, and the old asylum is one of them. Eerie whispers, the haunting shadows, and the terrifying presence that lurks within its walls, a reminder that some horrors should remain in the past, where they belong. I had always thought of myself as an experienced hiker, someone who knew how to navigate the wilderness with ease. But when I heard about the seasoned hiker who went missing in the national park, my confidence wavered. The park had a reputation, dark one, known for mysterious disappearances that left even the most skilled search teams baffled. I joined the search party with a sense of dread gnawing at my insides, eerie feeling that we were walking into something far more sinister than just a case of a lost hiker. As we retraced his steps, the forest seemed to swallow us whole, its towering trees casting long, haunting shadows across the ground. The deeper we ventured, the more the air grew thick with an unsettling silence. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive quiet that made my skin crawl. We followed the trail markers, but it felt like we were being led in circles, as if the forest itself was toying with us. That's when we found the first carving. It was etched into the bark of a massive oak tree, strange symbols that none of us could decipher. They were crude, almost primitive, and they sent a chill down my spine. The other searchers muttered nervously, but we pressed on, convinced that we were close to finding the missing hiker. Little did we know, those carvings were just the beginning of our nightmare. The further we went, the more symbols we found, each one more disturbing than the last. As the day wore on, the whispers began. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized the whispers had a rhythm to them, like words spoken just out of earshot. They seemed to follow us, flitting through the trees, always just beyond reach. I tried to ignore them, focusing on the search, but it was impossible. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. My heart raced as I scanned the dense forest, searching for any sign of the hiker, or whatever was making those sounds. We stumbled upon another carving, this one larger and more intricate than the others. It looked like a map, not of any place we recognized. The symbols were strange, almost otherworldly, and the air around it seemed to hum with energy. It was then that I realized we were dealing with something far beyond our understanding, something that had claimed the missing hiker, and now had its sights set on us. Desperation set in as we tried to find our way out. The forest seemed to shift around us, trees appearing where there had been none before, paths disappearing as soon as we turned our back. The whispers became voices, indistinct yet terrifying, echoing off the trees as if they were mocking us. And all the while, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hiker was still out there, trapped in this twisted place, waiting for us to join him. Finally, after what felt like hours, we stumbled out of the forest and back onto the main trail. The sudden return to normalcy was jarring, like waking from a nightmare. The terror lingered in our minds. We never found the hiker, and the search was eventually called off. But those carving, those whispers, they still haunt me. I know that whatever is out there in that forest is still waiting, and that anyone who ventures too far may never return. I've never gone back to that national park, and I warn others to stay away as well. The forest holds its secrets close, and those who seek to uncover them often find more than they bargained for. The vanishing hiker may be just one of many who have disappeared there, claimed by the eerie and haunting presence that lurks in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. We eventually came across his campsite, or what was left of it. Tent was collapsed, fire pit cold, and his gear was scattered across the ground. But there was no sign of him, no tracks, no footprints, nothing. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. The others in the search party began to panic, their nerves fraying under the weight of the eerie atmosphere. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, somewhere close, watching us. As night fell, the forest took on an entirely different character. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, and the whispers became more than just background noise. They were all around us, circling like predators, closing in. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. And then, just as suddenly as they had started, the whispers stopped, leaving behind a silence that was even more terrifying. That's when we saw the figure in the distance. It was barely more than a silhouette, standing motionless between the trees. I called out, but there was no response. The figure didn't move, didn't react, just stood there, watching. My instincts screamed at me to run, but something compelled me to move closer, see who or what it was. As I approached, the figure seemed to dissolve into the darkness, disappearing as if it had never been there at all. Panic set in among the group, and we decided to head back, abandoning the search for the night. But the forest wasn't done with us yet. As we tried to retrace our steps, we realized we were lost. The trail markers were gone, the trees all looked the same, and the whispers had returned, more menacing than ever. It felt like the forest was alive, deliberately leading us deeper into its heart, where something ancient and malevolent waited. The sea has always been my refuge, a place where I could find peace in the rhythmic rocking of the waves and the endless horizon. But that all changed one foggy morning in the North Atlantic. I was out on my small fishing boat, fog so thick I could barely see a few feet in front of me. The world felt eerily silent, the usual sounds of the ocean muffled by the dense mist. That's when I saw it, a dark shape looming in the fog, slowly drifting towards me. At first, I thought it was another fishing boat, but as it got closer, I realized this was no ordinary vessel. The ship looked ancient, once sturdy wood, now weathered and worn by years at sea. The sails hung limp, tattered by the wind, and the deck was eerily empty, with no signs of life. It was as if the ship had been abandoned, left to drift aimlessly through the fog. Something about it felt wrong, like a haunting presence clung to the vessel, watching me from the shadows. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to board the ship, my gut telling me I was about to uncover something chilling. As I climbed aboard, the air grew colder, and an eerie silence enveloped me, broken only by the creaking of the ship as it rocked gently on the waves. The deck was covered in a thin layer of sea salt, and the ropes hung slack, swaying slightly in the breeze. It was as if time had stopped on this ship, leaving everything frozen in place. I called out, my voice echoing across the empty deck, but there was no response. Crew was nowhere to be found, and yet there were signs of a struggle. Scattered belongings, overturned barrels, and strange marks on the wooden planks. It was as if something had happened here, something violent. There was no trace of blood, no bodies, nothing to explain the eerie emptiness of the ship. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved deeper into the vessel, each step feeling heavier than the last. Below deck, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The narrow corridors were dark and claustrophobic, and the smell of damp wood and salt water filled the air. I could hear the faint sound of water sloshing against the hull, but beyond that, there was only silence. I explored the cabins, finding them in disarray, personal items scattered about, as if the crew had left in a hurry. But there was no sign of where they had gone, no clues as to what had happened to them. As I continued to search, I stumbled upon the captain's quarters. The door creaked open with a haunting sound, revealing a room that looked untouched by time. A map lay open on the desk, and a half-empty bottle of rum sat beside it. The liquid inside long evaporated. But what caught my attention most was the logbook. Pages filled with the captain's meticulous handwriting. I flipped through it, trying to piece together the final days of the ship's journey. The entries started out normal enough. details of the weather, the ship's course, the usual routine of life at sea. But as I read on, the tone of the entries changed. Apton began to write about strange occurrences. A shadowy figure seen in the fog, unexplained sounds echoing through the ship at night, and a growing sense of unease among the crew. The last entry sent a chill down my spine. We are not alone. Something is out there, watching us. I fear we will not make it through the night. Just as I finished reading, I heard a noise. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a whisper carried on the wind. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The noise came again, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from somewhere deeper within the ship. My instincts screamed at me to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to know what had happened here. Against my better judgment, I followed the sound, each step echoing in the eerie silence. The sound led me to the cargo hold, a vast, dark space that seemed to stretch on forever. The air was thick, the smell of salt and decay, and the darkness was almost tangible, pressing in from all sides. I could hear the whispering again, faint and indistinct, as if it was coming from the very walls of the ship. I shone my flashlight into the darkness, and that's when I saw them. Shadows moving at the edge of the light, shifting and writhing as if alive. My heart raced as I realized I was not alone. The shadows seemed to grow, taking on vaguely human shapes, but they were twisted, unnatural. I backed away slowly, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel the cold grip of fear tightening around my chest. Whatever these things were, they were not of this world, and I knew I had to get off that ship before it was too late. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors as I made my way back to the deck. The ship seemed to come alive around me, the creaking of the wood turning into a cacophony of eerie sounds. I didn't stop until I was back on my boat, the ghostly ship fading into the fog behind me. As I sped away, I looked back one last time, and for a moment I could swear I saw figures standing on the deck, watching me with hollow eyes. I never reported the ship to the authorities, and I've kept this story to myself for years. Some things are better left forgotten, buried in the depths of the sea where they belong. But every now and then, when the fog rolls in thick and the sea is quiet, I can't help but wonder if that ship is still out there, drifting through the mist, waiting for its next unsuspecting visitor. The memory of that eerie encounter haunts me to this day, chilling reminder that some mysteries are best left unsolved. Driving through the desert always had a way of making me feel small. The vast, empty expanse stretching out in every direction, the heat shimmering off the sand. It was a hauntingly beautiful, yet unforgiving landscape. I was on a long stretch of road, miles away from the nearest town, with nothing but the sound of my engine and the wind whipping past my windows. It was midday when I first noticed it, a dark figure far off in the distance, barely more than a speck on the horizon. At first, I thought it was just a mirage, heat playing tricks on my eyes. But as I continued driving, I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was following me. Every time I glanced in my rearview mirror, it seemed to be a little closer, moving with a deliberate, unnerving pace. I tried to focus on the road ahead, telling myself it was nothing, that the eerie sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, the figure grew clearer. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. Its movements were unnatural, jerky and stiff, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized it was no longer just following me, it was chasing me. I pressed down on the gas, trying to put as much distance between us as possible, but no matter how fast I drove, it seemed to be getting closer. Night fell quickly in the desert, the once blinding heat replaced by a chilling cold. The figure had disappeared from view, swallowed by the darkness, but I could still feel its presence. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of something moving at the edge of my headlights, a fleeting shadow that sent shivers down my spine. The desert had become a vast, eerie void, and I was trapped in the middle of it, with no escape in sight. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that if I just kept driving, I'd eventually reach the next town, where I could find safety. But the road seemed to stretch on forever, and the sense of isolation was overwhelming. The figure's presence grew stronger, as if it was drawing nearer, feeding off my fear. And then, out of nowhere, my car sputtered and slowed to a stop. I was out of gas, stranded in the middle of nowhere, with something hunting me. Panic set in as I realized I was completely alone. The desert was silent, save for the faint sound of the wind, and the darkness pressed in on me from all sides. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal, no way to call for help. My only option was to stay in the car and wait for morning, hoping that whatever was out there would lose interest and move on. But deep down, I knew it wasn't going to be that easy. The hours dragged by, each one more terrifying than the last. I kept the doors locked, my eyes scanning the darkness outside, searching for any sign of movement. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible sound, like footsteps crunching on the sand. My heart raced as I strained to see through the windows, but all I could make out were shadows shifting in the darkness. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until they were right outside my door. I held my breath, too terrified to move, as the figure appeared out of the darkness. It was even more unsettling up close, its form twisted and distorted, like it didn't quite belong in this world. It stared at me through the window with hollow, empty eyes, and I could feel its cold presence seeping into the car. The air grew thick with fear, and I knew I had to do something before it was too late. In a desperate attempt to escape, I grabbed the flashlight from my glove compartment and shone it directly at the figure. For a moment, it recoiled, the light casting eerie shadows across its face. But then it lunged forward, slamming its hands against the window with a force that rattled the entire car. I screamed, fumbling with the keys as I tried to start the engine, but it was no use. The car was dead, and I was trapped. The figure circled the car, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the fear it had instilled in me. Every time it passed a window, it would stop and stare, the eyes boring into mine, before moving on to the next. I could feel my sanity slipping away, terror too much to bear. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the echo of my own heartbeat. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too scared to close my eyes, waiting for the figure to return. But it never did. When the first rays of sunlight finally broke through the darkness, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. I started the car, the engine roaring to life as if nothing had ever been wrong, and drove as fast as I could until I reached the nearest town. To this day, I don't know what that figure was or why it chose to stalk me through the desert. The memory of that night still haunts me, a chilling reminder that some things in this world defy explanation. The desert may seem vast and empty, but it holds its secrets close, and sometimes those secrets come looking for you. The locals warned us not to go there, but we didn't listen. It was just a remote forest after all. What could possibly be so bad about it? My friends and I wanted an adventure, something different from the usual camping spots. So we packed our gear and headed out. The drive took us far from civilization, deep into the wilderness, where the trees grew tall and the sky seemed to vanish beneath their canopy. By the time we arrived, the sun was already sinking low, casting long, eerie shadows across the forest floor. As we set up camp, the atmosphere felt heavier than usual, like the air itself was thick with something unseen. Trees loomed over us, their branches intertwining like twisted fingers reaching for the sky. Despite the quiet beauty of the place, there was an undercurrent of unease, a sense that we were not entirely welcome. The locals had called it cursed, but we laughed it off until the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows came alive. It started with whispers, faint and barely audible, carried on the wind that rustled through the leaves. We thought it was just our imagination, the product of too many scary stories shared around the campfire. But as the night wore on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from all directions, surrounding us. Yet there was no one there. The forest had gone silent, save for those eerie voices that sent chills down our spines. We tried to brush it off, telling ourselves it was just the wind. The feeling of being watched was impossible to shake. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made our hearts race. Firelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced around the campsite, and I couldn't help but feel like those shadows were more than just tricks of the light. They seemed to move with purpose, slipping between the trees, watching us from the darkness. As the hours dragged on, one of my friends, Sarah, decided she'd had enough. She announced she was going to the bathroom and headed into the woods, flashlight in hand. We waited, expecting her to return quickly, but minutes passed and she didn't come back. We called out for her, our voices echoing through the trees. There was no response. The uneasy feeling in my gut turned to dread as we realized something was wrong. We grabbed our flashlights and went searching for her. The forest seemed to swallow our voices. The trees pressed in from all sides, their shadows growing longer, darker, as if they were trying to trap us. We found her flashlight lying on the ground, still on. There was no sign of Sarah. Panic set in as we frantically searched the area, calling her name. The only answer was the haunting silence of the... Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadowy figure slipping between the trees, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I thought it was Sarah at first, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't her. The figure was taller, its movements unnatural, almost jerky, like it was being pulled by invisible strings. My heart raced as I tried to follow it, but it vanished into the darkness before I could get a closer look. The rest of the group caught up to me, and I told them what I saw. We decided to stick together, our nerves frayed by the eerie atmosphere and Sarah's disappearance. But as we made our way back to camp, the shadows seemed to multiply, closing in around us. Every time we thought we saw one of those figures, it would disappear the moment we shined our flashlights on it. It was like the forest itself was playing tricks on us, toying with our fear. By the time we reached the campsite, another friend, James, was gone. He had been right behind us one moment, and the next, he was just gone. No sound, no sign of struggle, just another empty space where one of us had been. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whatever was out there, it was taking us one by one. The shadows weren't just illusions, they were alive and they were hunting us. In a blind panic, we grabbed what we could and made a run for it, desperate to escape the cursed forest. But the shadows followed, their eerie presence growing stronger with every step. We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights flickering as the batteries drained, and all the while, the whispers taunted us, growing louder, more menacing. It felt like the forest itself was closing in, determined to trap us within its twisted grasp. Finally, we broke through the tree line, cool night air hitting our faces as we emerged from the forest. The relief was overwhelming, but it was short-lived. We looked back, expecting to see the shadows retreating, but instead they lingered at the edge of the trees, watching us with unseen eyes. We never found Sarah or James. We didn't dare go back to search for them. The forest had claimed them, just as the locals had warned. To this day, I don't know what those shadowy figures were, but their eerie presence still haunts my dreams. The Forest of Shadows remains a place of mystery and terror, its secrets hidden deep within the twisted trees. I'll never forget the feeling of those eyes watching me from the darkness, a chilling reminder that some places are cursed for a reason. And if you ever find yourself near that forest, take my advice. Stay far away, or you might just disappear into the shadows too. The cabin in the woods seemed like the perfect getaway, a secluded retreat where my family and I could escape the stresses of daily life. Nestled deep in the forest, it promised peace and tranquility, far from the chaos of the city. The drive there was scenic, trees towering above us as we wound our way along the narrow road. When we finally arrived, the cabin looked charming and rustic, just as advertised. But there was something about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on, that felt off. From the moment we stepped inside, the air felt different, heavier, colder, like the walls were holding on to something from the past. My wife dismissed it as my overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The cabin creaked and groaned as the wind blew through the trees outside, and every noise seemed amplified in the quiet. Still, we settled in, eager to enjoy our weekend getaway. The first night, as we sat around the fireplace, the eerie feeling grew stronger. The flames crackled and danced, casting long shadows across the room. My daughter, Emily, mentioned that she felt cold, even though the fire was roaring. I noticed it too, a sudden chill that seemed to seep into the room, despite the warmth of the flames. We brushed it off, trying to enjoy our evening, but the sense of unease lingered. That night, as we tried to sleep, the strange noises began. At first, it was just faint creaking, like the cabin was settling. But then the sounds grew louder. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving through the hallway outside our bedroom. I lay there, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was just the house. Deep down, I knew better. My wife stirred beside me, asking if I'd heard it too. We both listened intently. The footsteps had stopped. The next morning, we tried to laugh it off, blaming the wind and our overactive imaginations. But as the day went on, more unsettling things began to happen. Objects seemed to move on their own. A book left on the coffee table ended up on the floor. The front door that we knew we had locked swung open on its own. And Emily swore she saw someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching us. I went outside to check, but there was no one there. Just the eerie silence of the forest. By the second night, the haunting presence in the cabin was impossible to ignore. Cold spots grew more pronounced, appearing in random places throughout the house. And the strange noises continued. Whispers that seemed to come from the walls, soft laughter that echoed down the hallway. My wife and I were on edge, constantly looking over our shoulders, but we tried to stay calm for Emily's sake. We didn't want to scare her, though it was clear she was already frightened. That night, things took a turn for the worse. We were jolted awake by a loud bang, like something had slammed into the side of the cabin. The windows rattled, and the eerie feeling of being watched intensified. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of the bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. As I made my way down the hallway, the temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath in front of me. The cold spot was back, and it felt like it was moving toward me. The living room was in disarray, furniture knocked over, books scattered across the floor. But what caught my attention was the figure standing by the fireplace, barely visible in the dim light. It was a woman, her features shrouded in shadow, but there was something undeniably wrong about her. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, staring at me with hollow eyes. My breath caught in my throat as I realized this was no living person. I backed away slowly, my mind racing as I tried to figure out what to do. The figure didn't follow, but the air grew colder, the whispers louder, as if the very walls of the cabin were alive with voices. I ran back to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me, and told my wife we needed to leave. She didn't argue. She had seen enough to know that something wasn't right. We quickly packed our things, grabbing only the essentials, and rushed out of the cabin, leaving the eerie presence behind. As we drove away, the cabin disappeared into the distance, but the haunting feeling lingered. None of us spoke a word, too shaken by the experience to process what had just happened. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally allowed ourselves to breathe, tension slowly easing from our bodies. We never returned to that cabin, and we never spoke of what we saw there. But the memory of that weekend still haunts us. A chilling reminder that some places are not as peaceful as they seem. The cabin may have looked charming and rustic, but it held a dark secret, presence that refused to be ignored. Whether it was a restless spirit or something else entirely, I'll never know. But I do know one thing. The haunting cabin in the woods is not a place I'll ever visit again. Eerie silence, the cold spots, and the ghostly figure by the fireplace are etched into my memory. A reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. There's something about mountains that has always called to me. Challenge, the solitude, breathtaking views that make every grueling step worth it. But the mountain I chose to climb this time was different. It was remote, isolated, and held a dark history that even the most seasoned climbers avoided. Locals called it the Mountain of the Dead, and stories of tragic accidents and unexplained disappearances swirled around it like the fog that often cloaked it. I thought the tales were just that, stories. But I was about to find out how wrong I was. The climb started like any other. Crisp mountain air filled my lungs, and the crunch of my boots on the rocky terrain echoed in the stillness. The higher I climbed, the more the world below faded away, leaving only me and the mountain. But as I ascended, a strange feeling began to settle in the pit of my stomach, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake. The wind picked up, carrying with it a faint, eerie whistle. It seemed almost like a distant wail. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the path ahead. The mountain felt alive. About halfway up, the weather turned. Thick fog rolled in, obscuring the path and reducing visibility to almost nothing. The temperature dropped sharply, and I could see my breath hanging in the air. The world around me became ghostly, the jagged rocks and twisted trees emerging and disappearing like phantoms. It was then that I saw the first of them, figures in the mist, barely more than shadows, undeniably human. At first I thought they were other climbers, but when I called out, they didn't respond. As I drew closer, the figures became clearer, pale, ghostly forms of climbers who had met their end on this mountain. Their eyes were hollow, their faces etched with expressions of eternal sorrow. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized I was seeing the spirits of those who had perished here. They watched me silently, their presence both chilling and mournful. I pressed on, determined to reach the summit, but their haunting gazes followed me every step of the way. The higher I climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around me like a suffocating shroud. The wind howled through the peaks, carrying with it eerie whispers that I couldn't quite make out. It felt like the mountain itself was conspiring against me, trying to force me to turn back. But I was stubborn, driven by a need to conquer this cursed peak, even as every instinct screamed at me to leave. As night fell, I found a small ledge to set up camp, but sleep didn't come easily. The shadows seemed to move on their own, twisting and shifting in the flickering light of my headlamp. Every rustle of the wind sounded like footsteps, and the eerie whispers grew louder, more insistent. I lay there, wide awake, feeling the weight of the mountain pressing down on me. And then, in the dead of night, I heard it. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from deep within the earth. I bolted upright, my heart racing as I scanned the darkness. The growl came again, louder this time, reverberating through the rocks beneath me. It was then that I realized the mountain wasn't just haunted by the spirits of the dead. It was alive, and it was angry. The ground trembled beneath me, and I knew I had to get off this cursed peak, or it claimed me too. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my gear. The fog had thickened into an impenetrable wall, and the path I had taken up the mountain seemed to have vanished. Panic set in as I realized I was lost, trapped on a mountain that didn't want me there. The shadows closed in, the growl of the earth growing louder, more menacing. And then I saw them again, the ghostly figures of the lost climbers, standing just beyond the reach of my light. They weren't just watching me this time. They were moving, slowly but deliberately, toward me. Their hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a cold dread settle over me. It was as if they were trying to pull me into their world, to make me one of them. I stumbled backward, nearly losing my footing on the loose rocks, but I managed to keep moving, driven by sheer terror. The climb down was a blur, frantic scramble to escape the mountain's grasp. By the time I reached the base, the fog had lifted and the world seemed normal again. But I knew better. The Mountain of the Dead wasn't just a place, it was a presence, a malevolent force that had claimed the lives of countless climbers and would continue to do so. I had escaped, just barely, and the memory of those ghostly figures still haunts me. Their eerie whispers echo in my mind, chilling reminder of the price some pay for daring to challenge the mountain. I've climbed many peaks in my life, but I'll never return to that one. The Mountain of the Dead has earned its name, and I've learned to respect the power of a place that holds so many souls captive. If you ever find yourself near that mountain, take my advice. Stay far away. the summit isn't worth the cost. And the eerie presence that lingers there is something you'll never forget. It was supposed to be just another stop on our Eastern European road trip. Quaint, picturesque village that wasn't even on the map. My partner and I stumbled upon it by accident, drawn in by the cobblestone streets, England charm, and the air of mystery that hung over the place. The village looked like something out of a storybook, with its stone cottages, winding lanes, and ivy-covered walls. But as we wandered through the quiet streets, it quickly became clear that something wasn't right. There were no people, not a single soul. The houses were all in perfect condition, as if the villagers had just stepped out for a moment and would return any second, but the silence was eerie, oppressive, as if the whole village was holding its breath. We called out, hoping to find someone, anyone, but our voices echoed off the stone walls with no response. The air was still, and the only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. It was as if the entire village had simply vanished. We explored further, hoping to find some explanation. The village square was empty, the market stalls abandoned, but everything was untouched. No signs of struggle, no indication of where the villagers had gone. It was like they had disappeared into thin air. As we wandered through the streets, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Shadows seemed to flit at the edge of our vision, but whenever we turned to look, there was nothing there. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, we convinced ourselves that the villagers would return soon, perhaps from working in the fields or attending a nearby festival. We decided to stay the night, figuring we'd get answers in the morning. We found an old inn, its doors unlocked, and settled in, though the eerie silence of the place made it hard to relax. The rooms were cozy but empty, as if waiting for guests who would never arrive. That night, the village's true nature revealed itself. It started with faint noises, whispers that seemed to drift through the walls, growing louder as the night wore on. We tried to ignore them, but it was impossible to sleep. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and we could see our breath in the dim light. My partner suggested we leave, but when we looked out the window, we saw that the village had changed. The once picturesque streets were now shrouded in mist, and strange shapes moved in the darkness. The village no longer felt quaint and charming. It felt menacing, like it was alive and aware of us. We heard footsteps in the hallway outside our room, slow and deliberate, but when we opened the door, there was no one there. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like voices trying to tell us something we couldn't understand. Panicked, we decided to leave immediately, but as we stepped outside, the village seemed to close in around us. The fog thickened, and the streets twisted and turned, leading us in circles, no matter which way we went. It was as if the village itself didn't want us to leave. The shadows grew darker, more tangible, and we could feel eyes watching us from every corner. My heart pounded in my chest as we desperately searched for a way out. As we stumbled through the fog, we realized we were not alone. Figures began to appear in the mist, vague shapes that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were the villagers, or what was left of them. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes hollow and lifeless. They moved slowly, as if weighed down by something unseen, and their whispers filled the air, growing louder as they drew closer. We ran, fear driving us through the twisting streets, but the villagers followed, their presence suffocating. The fog grew thicker, the village more labyrinthine, until we were utterly lost. Every turn led us back to the same place, the eerie square with its abandoned market stalls. Whispers became deafening, and the villagers closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on us. I felt a cold dread settle over me, the realization that we might never escape this place. Just when all hope seemed lost, we found ourselves at the edge of the village, a road leading back to the world we knew. We didn't look back, didn't stop running until we were far away from that cursed place. As we drove through the night, the village disappeared behind us, swallowed by the mist. But the memory of those eerie whispers and lifeless villagers haunts us still. We never spoke of that night to anyone, and we've made a pact never to return. The disappearing village remains a mystery, a place that exists outside of time, hidden from the world. If you ever stumble upon it, take my advice. Don't stop, don't explore, and don't stay the night. The village may seem charming, but it holds a dark secret, and once you're there, it may never let you go. It had been a long, exhausting drive, and the sight of the motel's flickering neon sign was a welcome relief. The Last Stop Motel, as the sign proclaimed, stood alone on a desolate stretch of highway, surrounded by nothing but endless darkness. It wasn't much to look at, run down, with peeling paint and cracked windows, but at that point, I didn't care. I just needed a place to rest for the night before continuing my journey in the morning. The lobby was just as shabby as the exterior, with dim lighting and a musty smell that clung to the air. The receptionist, a pale, gaunt man with hollow eyes, barely looked up as I checked in. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as he handed me the key to room 13. I couldn't help but feel a shiver run down my spine at the number, but I brushed it off as exhaustion playing tricks on me. After all, it was just a room. What could possibly go wrong? The room itself was no better than the lobby. The bed was lumpy, the carpet stained, and the wallpaper peeling at the edges. But it was quiet, and after hours on the road, that was all I needed. I locked the door, set my bag down, and collapsed onto the bed, too tired to care about the state of the place. As I lay there, the silence pressed in, broken only by the occasional creak of the old building settling. Sleep didn't come easily. There was something about the room that felt off. The air was heavy, almost suffocating, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should have. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a presence, like someone or something was watching me. I told myself it was just paranoia, the result of being in a strange place, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It clung to me, a chilling sense of unease that made my skin crawl. Around midnight, the noises started. At first, it was just a faint tapping sound, like someone lightly knocking on the wall. I ignored it, hoping it would go away, but it grew louder, more insistent. Then came the voices, muffled, indistinct, as if coming from the room next door. I pressed my ear to the wall, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. It was unsettling, but again, I tried to brush it off. After all, it was an old motel. Noises were to be expected, right? But the tapping didn't stop. It grew louder, more rhythmic, like something, or someone, was trying to get my attention. I got up and opened the door, expecting to find an empty hallway, but instead I was met with the sight of the other guests. If you could even call them that. They were standing there, lined up along the walls, their faces pale and expressionless, their eyes empty and hollow. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. What the hell was going on? I tried to tell myself it was just a nightmare, that I was dreaming, but the fear was too real. The tapping continued, now joined by the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing outside my door. I held my breath, listening as the footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps that echoed through the room. I didn't know how to answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but nothing about it made sense. I could feel his eyes on me, old and unblinking, and the air in the car grew thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. I glanced at the road, trying to focus on driving. The hitchhiker's question hung in the air, unanswered. Suddenly, the car's temperature plummeted, and the windows fogged up. The hitchhiker's form seemed to waver, his outline growing hazy and indistinct. My heart raced as I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. I pressed down on the gas, desperate to put distance between us, but the hitchhiker's presence only grew stronger, filling the car with a cold, suffocating darkness. And then, just as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. I glanced over, and the passenger seat was empty, as if he had never been there at all. The car's interior slowly warmed, and the fog on the windows dissipated, leaving only the faint memory of that chilling encounter. I kept driving, my heart pounding in my chest, unwilling to stop until I reached the safety of the nearest town. When I finally pulled into a gas station, I got out of the car, my legs shaking beneath me. I looked back at the highway, half expecting to see the hitchhiker standing there, waiting for me. but the road was empty, stretching out into the night as if nothing had ever happened. I never saw the hitchhiker again, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The haunted highway remains a place of mystery, a stretch of road where the lines between the living and the dead blur. If you ever find yourself driving there late at night, be careful who you pick up. The hitchhiker may seem real, but he belongs to a different world, one that's colder, darker, and far more terrifying than you can imagine. There's something undeniably eerie about Ghost Town. Places where time seems to have stopped, where the past lingers in the air like a forgotten memory. I've always been fascinated by them, so when my friends and I stumbled upon an old, abandoned town in the middle of the desert, we couldn't resist the urge to explore. The town was a relic from the Wild West. Wooden buildings weathered and decaying, but still standing, like sentinels guarding the secrets of the past. The silence was overwhelming, broken only by the occasional creak of a door swinging in the wind. The streets were empty, the saloons and general stores long since abandoned, but there was a strange sense of life about the place, as if the town was waiting for something. We wandered through the dusty streets, taking in the haunting beauty of the place, and we came across the graveyard, a small, overgrown plot of land on the outskirts of town. The graveyard was filled with old, crumbling tombstones, their inscriptions faded by time. Most of the graves dated back to the late 1800s, testament to the town's long-forgotten history. There was something unsettling about the place, though, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The air was thick with a sense of unease, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we explored the graveyard, we began to notice strange things. Temperature seemed to drop suddenly, despite the blazing desert sun, and shadows moved in ways they shouldn't have. We heard faint whispers, carried on the wind, but when we turned to look, there was no one there. The further we ventured into the graveyard, the stronger the eerie feeling became, until it was almost suffocating. It wasn't long before we realized we weren't alone. At first, it was just a fleeting glimpse, a shadowy figure moving between the tombstones, too quick to catch. Then, the whispers grew louder, more distinct, and we could make out words, fragments of conversations from another time, voices that didn't belong to the present. My heart raced as I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, just our imaginations playing tricks on us. But deep down, I knew better. One of my friends, Jake, decided to take a closer look at one of the larger tombstones. As he brushed away the dirt and debris, he uncovered a name, Margaret Blackwell, and a date of death that sent chills down my spine. October 31st, 1888. There was something about the name that felt familiar, though I couldn't quite place it. Jake laughed it off, but I could see the unease in his eyes as he read the inscription aloud. That's when the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the whispers turned into low, guttural moans, and the shadows began to move more deliberately, closing in around us. I could feel eyes on me, watching from every direction, and the sense of dread was overwhelming. The ghost town no longer felt like a forgotten relic. It felt alive, and it didn't want us there. Suddenly, Jake froze, his eyes wide with terror. He pointed to the edge of the graveyard, where a figure stood, all enshrouded in darkness, its features obscured by a tattered cloak. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at us with an intensity that made my blood run cold. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were warning us to leave, but we were too terrified to move. The figure began to glide toward us, its movements slow and deliberate, and I knew we had to get out of there. We turned and ran, stumbling over tombstones and tripping on the uneven ground as we made our way back to the safety of the town. But the ghostly presence followed, its shadow stretching across the desert floor, reaching for us with icy fingers. The air was thick with the sound of whispers and moans, and I could feel the weight of the past pressing down on us. When we finally reached the edge of the graveyard, temperature seemed to return to normal, and the eerie feeling began to fade. We didn't stop running until we were back in our car, the ghost town disappearing into the distance behind us. None of us spoke a word as we sped away, too shaken by what we had experienced. The memory of that day still haunts us, a chilling reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The ghost town graveyard is a place where the past and present collide, where the spirits of the dead linger, unable to find peace. If you ever come across a place like that, take my advice. Don't go looking for answers. The whispers of the past may be intriguing, but they can also be dangerous. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, and the ghosts of the Old West are not as quiet as you might think. I've always been fascinated by history, particularly the hidden, forgotten parts of it. So when I heard about an old, abandoned military bunker deep in the woods, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The bunker was a relic from a time long past, rumored to have been used for top-secret experiments during the Cold War. Most people had forgotten it even existed, but the stories of what happened there still lingered, whispered among those who dared to remember. The hike to the bunker was long and treacherous, forest thick and overgrown, as if nature itself was trying to keep the place hidden. When I finally found it, the entrance was almost completely obscured by vines and moss. The heavy steel door rusted and barely hanging on its hinges. The air around the bunker was still, almost too quiet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But my curiosity got the best of me, and I pushed the door open with a groan of protest from the metal. Inside, the bunker was cold and damp, the walls lined with crumbling concrete and rusting pipes. The smell of mildew and decay filled the air, and the only light came from my flashlight, casting long, eerie shadows in the narrow corridors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The deeper I ventured, the more unsettling the atmosphere became. It felt as if the bunker was alive, its walls closing in around me, trapping me in its forgotten depths. As I explored, I stumbled upon old, decayed equipment, desks covered in dust, broken computers, and scattered papers that had long since yellowed with age. Most of the documents were illegible, their ink faded and smeared, but a few words stood out. Experiment, containment, failure. My heart raced as I tried to piece together what had happened here, but the more I uncovered, the more I wished I hadn't. The deeper I went into the bunker, the stronger the sense of dread became. The air grew colder, silence more suffocating, and the feeling of being watched intensified. I could almost hear whispers, faint and indistinct, echoing off the concrete walls. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own. I told myself it was just my imagination, but the fear gnawing at my insides told me otherwise. Finally, I reached a door at the end of a long corridor, its heavy steel surface scarred and dented, as if something had tried to break through. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped through the gap, bearing with it a faint metallic smell that made my stomach churn. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, but I couldn't resist the pull of whatever lay beyond. The room behind the door was a large open space, filled with old, decaying equipment and strange machines that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. But what caught my attention most was the large, glass chamber in the center of the room. The glass was cracked and fogged with condensation. I could make out the vague shape of something inside, something that wasn't human. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached the chamber, my flashlight flickering wildly. The closer I got, the more I could see. A twisted, grotesque figure, its limbs contorted in unnatural ways, its eyes lifeless and hollow. The thing inside the chamber was long dead, but the sight of it sent chills down my spine. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of experiments had been conducted here, and what had gone so horribly wrong. As I stood there, staring at the thing in the chamber, I heard a noise, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like the scraping of metal against concrete. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the room, but there was nothing there. The silence returned. The feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I backed away from the chamber, my nerves on edge, and that's when I saw it, a shadow moving in the corner of the room, just at the edge of the light. Panic set in as I realized I wasn't alone. The shadow moved closer, its shape shifting and distorting in the flickering light. I couldn't see what it was, but I could feel its presence, cold, malevolent, and utterly inhuman. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the bunker as I fled back the way I had come. The shadows seemed to follow me, their movements erratic and unnatural, like they were trying to trap me within the walls. By the time I reached the entrance, my heart was pounding in my chest, and my breath came in ragged gasps. I burst through the door and into the cool night air, the oppressive weight of the bunker finally lifting. I didn't stop running until I was far away, the bunker disappearing into the darkness behind me. I never went back, and I never told anyone what I found there. The forgotten bunker remains a mystery, a place where the horrors of the past still linger, waiting to be uncovered by the next unlucky soul who stumbles upon it. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and you come across an old rusted door hidden among the trees, take my advice, leave it alone. Some secrets are better left buried, and the things that were created in that bunker are not something you want to find. There's something about old wells that has always intrigued me. Maybe it's the darkness that seems to stretch endlessly downward, or the way they seem to whisper secrets from the past. When I first heard about the haunted well in the small, forgotten town of Clearwater, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. Locals spoke of it in hushed tones, warning of strange occurrences and unexplained disappearances over the years. The well stood in the center of an overgrown field, stone walls crumbling with age, yet it still held an eerie presence. The journey to Clearwater was long, the road winding through dense forests and past abandoned buildings that seemed to have been forgotten by time. By the time I arrived, the sun was already sinking low, casting long shadows across the landscape. The town itself was little more than a ghost town, its streets empty, buildings weathered and decaying. It felt like a place that had been left behind, and the well at its center seemed to be the heart of that desolation. As I approached the well, the air grew colder, and a sense of unease settled over me. The stone walls were covered in moss, and the wooden cover that once sealed the well had long since rotted away. I peered into the darkness below, my flashlight barely penetrating the inky blackness. The air that wafted up from the depths was cool and damp, carrying with it a faint, metallic smell made my stomach turn. But what unnerved me the most were the faint whispers that seemed to echo from within the well, like voices calling out from the dark. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, the way the air moved through the narrow stone walls. But as I listened closer, the whispers grew more distinct, more urgent. They seemed to be saying something, but I couldn't make out the words. The sound sent chills down my spine, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was down there, watching me from the darkness. Determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, I lowered a rope with a camera attached into the well, hoping to capture whatever lay hidden in the depth. The camera's light flickered as it descended, illuminating the rough stone walls and the stagnant water far below. But as the camera neared the bottom, the feed suddenly cut out, the screen going black. I tried to reel it back up, but the rope was stuck, as if something had grabbed hold of it. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to free the rope, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and the air around me seemed to grow colder by the second. Just when I was about to give up, the rope suddenly went slack, and I pulled it up as fast as I could. The camera was gone. Only the frayed end of the rope remained, as if it had been torn apart by something unseen. Panic set in as I realized I had disturbed something in the well, something that didn't want to be found. The whispers had turned into low, guttural moans, echoing up from the darkness, and I could feel the air around me grow thick with an oppressive, malevolent presence. I backed away from the well, my heart racing. The feeling of being watched followed me, as if the darkness itself had eyes. As I turned to leave, I saw it, a shadowy figure standing at the edge of the field, barely visible in the fading light. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze on me, cold and unrelenting. The whispers seemed to come from it, growing louder with each passing second, and I knew I had to get out of there before it was too late. I ran back to my car, eerie feeling of the well pressing in on me from all sides. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from Clearwater, haunting whispers still echoing in my mind. I never went back to that town, and I've never spoken of what I found there. The haunted well remains a mystery, a place where the past refuses to stay buried, and where the darkness holds secrets too terrifying to uncover. If you ever find yourself near Clearwater, take my advice. Stay away from the well. The whispers may call to you, but they don't want to be answered. The wilderness has always been my escape, a place where I could lose myself in the serenity of nature. But one particular trip, deep into the mountains of the Pacific Northwest, turned into something I could never have imagined. I had set out on a solo hike, eager to explore a remote trail that few had ever ventured. The forest was thick, the trees towering above me like ancient sentinels, their branches forming a dense canopy that barely let any light through. It was peaceful, almost otherworldly, and I reveled in the solitude. As the day wore on, I noticed the light fading faster than usual. The sun was still high in the sky, but the forest seemed to be growing darker, the shadows lengthening unnaturally. I shrugged it off at first, thinking it was just the thick canopy playing tricks on my eyes. But as the darkness continued to creep in, a sense of unease settled over me. The birds had gone silent, and the usual sounds of the forest, the rustling leaves, the distant calls of animals, vanished. By the time I realized something was wrong, it was too late. The darkness had swallowed the forest whole, plunging me into an eerie twilight. Felt suffocating. My flashlight barely penetrated the gloom, its beam weak and flickering, as if the darkness itself was resisting it. The trail ahead was barely visible, and the trees seemed to close in around me, their twisted branches forming unnatural shapes in the dim light. I tried to retrace my steps. The trail seemed to have vanished. Every turn led me deeper into the darkness, and the eerie silence was broken only by the sound of my own footsteps crunching on the forest floor. It was then that I heard it, faint, distant hum that seemed to come from all around me. It was low and steady, almost like the sound of machinery, but there was no civilization for miles. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel it vibrating through the ground beneath my feet. Panic began to set in as I realized I was hopelessly lost. The darkness was unnatural, thicker than any night I had ever experienced, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own. My heart raced as I tried to find my way out. The trees all looked the same, their branches twisting and contorting in ways that defied logic. The hum continued to grow louder, reverberating through the air, and I could feel it resonating in my chest, making it hard to breathe. As I stumbled through the darkness, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees, too quick to be an animal. I turned to look. There was nothing there, just the impenetrable darkness. The feeling of being watched was undeniable, and I knew I wasn't alone. The shadows seemed to dance at the edge of my vision, always just out of reach, taunting me with their presence. Then, out of nowhere, the hum stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying, thick and oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood frozen, my flashlight flickering weakly in the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the distance, barely visible in the gloom. It was tall and thin, its form distorted by the shadows, and it didn't move, just stood there, watching me with eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure remained still, presence more unsettling with each passing second. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, trapped in the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. The figure finally took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and the air around me grew colder, heavy, with an unnatural chill. Desperation took over, and I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I blindly stumbled through the forest. The darkness seemed to close in around me, the trees forming a labyrinth that twisted and turned, leading me in circles. I could feel the figure's presence behind me, relentless and unyielding, its cold gaze burning into my back. Every step felt like a struggle, the air thick with the oppressive weight of the darkness. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I broke through the tree line and into a clearing. The darkness receded slightly, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for me to catch my breath. But the eerie feeling remained, and I knew I wasn't safe. I looked back at the forest, half expecting to see the figure standing at the edge. There was nothing there, just the silent, impenetrable darkness. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. As I drove away, the memory of that mysterious darkness lingered, haunting me long after I had left the forest behind. I never returned to that trail, and I've never spoken of what I experienced there. The darkness remains a mystery, a place where the natural world seems to blur with something far more sinister. If you ever find yourself deep in the woods and the light begins to fade, take my advice. Leave while you can. The darkness may seem like just another night, but it's watching, waiting, and it's always hungry for more. I've always considered myself a seasoned hiker, someone who could handle the solitude and challenges of the wilderness. But nothing could have prepared me for the eerie experience I had during what was supposed to be a routine solo camping trip. It was deep in the heart of the Rocky Mountains, far from any trails or campsites. Kind of place where you could truly disconnect from the world, where no one would find you unless you wanted to be found. The first day was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp, and the views were breathtaking. I set up camp near a small, secluded lake, the water so still it reflected the sky like a mirror. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I settled in for the night, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees lulling me to sleep. But as darkness fell, atmosphere shifted. The wilderness, which had felt so peaceful during the day, took on an eerie, almost menacing quality. I woke in the middle of the night to an unsettling silence. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, distant animal calls, were gone, replaced by a heavy stillness that made my skin crawl. I lay there, listening intently, my heart pounding, my heart ding in my chest. That's when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic tapping sound like someone, or something, was knocking on a tree somewhere in the distance. The sound was so out of place, so unnatural, that it sent chills down my spine. I told myself it was just a woodpecker, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, echoing through the trees. It was as if it was trying to get my attention, to draw me out of my tent. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, until the sound finally stopped. But the silence that followed was even more unnerving, as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The next morning, I found strange markings on the trees surrounding my campsite. They were crude, almost like claw marks, but too deliberate to be the work of an animal. The bark was stripped away in long, jagged lines, and the sight of it made my stomach churn. I tried to convince myself it was just a coincidence, but the eerie feeling that had settled over the campsite the night before lingered, gnawing at my nerves. As the day wore on, couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, set my heart racing. The wilderness, which had once felt like a refuge, now felt like a prison. And I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. Forest seemed to close in around me, the trees casting long, haunting shadows that seemed to move on their own. That night, the tapping returned, louder and closer than before. It echoed through the darkness, each knock sending a jolt of fear through my body. I sat up in my tent, clutching my flashlight, but I couldn't bring myself to look outside. Tapping was relentless, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat, and I could feel the presence of whatever was making it drawing nearer. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what to do, but the fear was paralyzing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, and the air in the tent felt heavy, suffocating. I held my breath, listening for any sign of movement, but there was nothing, just the eerie stillness of the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, too terrified to sleep, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be out there. At first light, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. the eerie feeling still hanging over me like a dark cloud. As I made my way back to the trailhead, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow slipping between the trees, too quick to be anything but a trick of the light. But the feeling of being watched never went away. By the time I reached my car, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I drove away from the wilderness, the memory of those eerie nights still fresh in my mind. I've hiked many trails since then, but I've never gone back to that remote spot in the Rocky. The solitude I once cherished now feels tainted, haunted by the memory of the tapping in the night and the sense of something watching me from the darkness. You ever find yourself alone in the wilderness? Take my advice. Trust your instinct. The forest may seem peaceful during the day, but when night falls, it can become a very different place. The silence, the shadows, the feeling of being watched, it's all too easy to dismiss it as paranoia. Sometimes the wilderness hides things that are better left undiscovered.